Chapter 121. At midnight, Kunlun Mountain shook violently. A thunderous sound came from the ground. The wind and clouds changed color, the stars went astray, the mountains collapsed, and the rivers boiled. In a flash, it spread outside the mountain. Kunwa city seemed to be facing a huge wave. Countless pavilions collapsed and the whole city was noisy. Men and women went out on the streets. Many of them were naked and looked very embarrassed. There were many casualties and injuries. At dawn, the Kunlun party sent many disciples down the mountain to help the people in danger. Because of this, the people calmed down and the situation gradually eased. Not to mention the chaos in the city at the foot of the mountain, in Kunlun Mountain, there were continuous aftershocks that night. The ground shook more than 10 times until dawn. Under the morning light, the mountains were still majestic, but many places were broken. It was clear that the damage last night was terrible. Fortunately, the Kunlun party was a famous cultivation sect with many profound disciples. The headmaster, Idle Month, was able to command and quickly stabilize the situation. Around noon, the Kunlun party was already in order. Not to mention handling the chores, Immortal Idle Month also looked smart and capable. Even if the incident happened in a hurry, he still handled it with ease. At this moment, he was in the Xingyang Hall on the main peak of the Kunlun party, Tiankuan Peak. He ordered his disciples to do things one by one. More than 10 groups of people came and went, and none of his orders were repeated. After the last group of people left, Immortal Idle Month also let out a long breath. He took a sip of the spiritual tea on the table and glanced at the cup. He saw that the tea leaves in the water were small, delicate, and strangely shaped. They looked like auspicious animals and cranes. When they floated in the water, they looked like cranes dancing. It was very magical. The tea was mellow. It was the famous tea of the E family in Kunwa City, Little Crane. Immortal Idle Month stared at it for a moment and put the cup aside. At the same time, he didn't look relaxed. He must be worried because of the earthquake last night. At this moment, he suddenly heard footsteps coming from the rear hall of the main hall, walking towards him. After a moment, a figure appeared. It was his junior brother Zhuoxian. Perfected Idle Month was a little surprised. He looked at Zhuoxian and asked, "Junior brother, why are you here?" Zhuoxian bowed to him, but the expression on his face was somewhat serious. He quickly stepped aside, revealing a petite figure behind him. It was a beautiful young girl, White Lotus. At this moment, White Lotus's expression was chilly while she held an ancient jade disc in her hands. The disc was around a foot in size, and its center was pure white. Strange talisman markings flickered successively in a circle around it, and it seemed as if a mysterious energy was effusing out from it at all times. Wind Whisper Disc. Perfected Idle Month was shocked. She hurriedly got down from her seat and strode in front of White Lotus. With a solemn expression, she bowed respectfully to White Lotus. The perfected headmaster of Kunlun had a very high status. However, White Lotus did not move away from such etiquette. She did not make a sound and only stood there expressionlessly. Zhuoxian, who was beside her, did not seem to be moved at all. After a moment, the jade disc in White Lotus's arms suddenly shone brightly. More than 10 talisman markings lit up at the same time. The pure white light swayed and gathered, forming a light screen in the center of the jade disc. A sharp whistling sound of wind and snow suddenly came from the Wind Whisper disc. The light screen trembled and gradually became clear. It showed a sky full of whistling wind and snow. Other than that, nothing else could be seen. Perfected Idle Month and Zhuoxian stood together and said respectfully at the same time, "Greetings, Master." "Forget it." A low and desolate voice came from the depths of the wind and snow in the jade disc. It seemed as if it came from behind the wind and snow, but it also seemed as if it was far away, an unreachable place. Perfected Idle Month straightened his body and revealed a trace of a smile as he looked at the girl. It was also at this moment that White Lotus's face showed a trace of expression. She lowered her head slightly and said softly, "Senior brother sect leader, White Lotus has been impolite." "It's all right." Perfected Idol Month said kindly. He then looked at the wind-whispered disc and said respectfully, Master, you suddenly used the treasure disc to meet me. Do you have something important to tell me? The ancient wind-whispered disc flashed with spiritual light. The wind and snow became stronger, and the old and distant voice also came. After the earthquake, is the sect still stable? Perfected Idol Month said, I have already handled everything properly. The people on the mountain and at the foot of the mountain are not in a mess. Now, the rescue and restoration work has begun. Please rest assured, Master. Good. Perfected Idol Month pondered for a moment. He then looked at the wind-whispered disc and asked tentatively, Master, I felt that the beginning of the earthquake last night seemed to come from the ground between the clouds and the sky, including the strange light that shot into the sky at the beginning of last night. Is there any damage in the Forbidden Land? No. Perfected Idol Month looked down slightly and said, Yes, I understand. Woo. A sudden gust of wind seemed to blow in the wind-whispered disc and hit the light curtain. Although it did not spread outside the light curtain, the lifelike appearance still seemed to make people feel a chill in their hearts. At the same time, the old and low voice came again in the wind and snow. Idol Month, write a letter immediately and send it to Immortal City. Perfected Idol Month's expression changed slightly. She said, Master, you are asking Martial Uncle Tianlan. Ask Junior Brother Tianlan to come back to the mountain to see me immediately. The voice was like tearing silk, mixed with the wind knives and snow swords. It seemed to have its own fierce momentum, causing the spacious hall to become cold in an instant. Perfected Idol Month immediately said, Yes, disciple obeys. On the wind-whispered disc, the wind and snow were still blowing mournfully, but the sound gradually became smaller and the picture gradually faded. Just like that, it slowly darkened until it disappeared. Lu Chen did not sleep all night. When the Kunlun mountain was shaking and the earth was shaking, he still stayed quietly in his house, quietly looking at the deep darkness in the distance. The sudden black fire was reignited, burning on his flesh and blood. But this time, the black fire was obviously different from the black fire curse that had entangled him for the past 10 years. Although there was also an indescribable pain that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, his flesh was not damaged at all. The black fire just danced wildly on his body, like a reluctant devil, but could no longer hurt him. Lu Chen waited quietly. When the sky was about to brighten and the earthquake finally stopped completely, the black fire on his body seemed to calm down and slowly converge. He just stood there, standing in the black fire, and then slowly stretched out his right hand. The black fire, like a receding tide, receded from his whole body. From his head to his feet, the black fire piled up in waves and then converged into a silent fire flow, finally flowing into the palm of his right hand. It condensed into a black flame, quietly burning in the palm of Lu Chen. Lu Chen looked down at the black flame and did not speak for a long time. There seemed to be a light in the depths of his eyes, echoing with the black fire. At the same time, he could clearly feel that in his sea of qi and dantian, the original rough 5 elements disc had turned over again, revealing the other side of the deep darkness like the endless night. The black divine disc. But there was no small black fire. Lu Chen quietly looked at the black fire in the palm of his hand. Suddenly, his 5 fingers closed and slowly clenched. The next moment, he suddenly clenched his hand into a fist. In his ears, in a strange and distant place, there seemed to be a sudden explosion of thunder. A few ripples that were hard to see with the naked eye suddenly appeared around his body, like silk threads in a storm, violently trembling, drawing strange lines and ripples in the void. Pa 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 pa, a series of crisp sounds rang out. A strange sound came from beneath his feet at the same time. Lu Chen looked down and saw that the ground beneath his feet had suddenly cracked open. A chair not far away from him, on the side closest to him, suddenly turned into powder without a sound and scattered to the ground. After a moment, the remaining half of the stool fell woodenly, falling to the ground with a pa sound. Lu Chen stood in the same place, silent for a long time, and then slowly stretched out his palm again. The black fire had disappeared. After a moment, he looked at his abdomen, under his flesh, in the Sea of Chi, on the incomparably strange black divine disk, a cluster of black fire reignited, quietly burning in the deep darkness. Then, as if the night was about to pass, as if the sky was sprinkling again, as if the sun and moon were rotating, his 5 elements disk slowly turned over. The darkness gradually receded, and the light slowly came. In the light, the black side turned over, and what reappeared was a familiar pillar of the divine disk. As a result, he became the ordinary Lu Chen, the small odd-job disciple like an ant. Lu Chen raised his head and looked into the distance, only to see that the sky was already bright. In the distance, the Kunlun mountain range was towering, as if it did not care about the earthquake last night, already standing in the world like a giant. After all, the darkness belonged to the night. After dawn, there was no trace of it. He let out a long breath, turned around, and just when he was about to call out, he was suddenly startled. He did not see the figure of Atsu in this room. Lu Chen subconsciously looked at the door, only to see that the door was still closed. Although there was a big earthquake last night, the house was also damaged, including several cracks on the wall, but it did not collapse, and was generally still intact. Lu Chen frowned and called the name of Atsu a few times, but there was no response. He became more and more puzzled. He searched the house for a while, and then found a small hole in a remote corner at the back of the house. Looking at the size, it seemed that Atsu could barely pass through. Did that dog run out of here? In this panic, everywhere was a mess. Where would this stupid dog run to? Lu Chen looked at the dog hole in the corner speechlessly. After a moment of silence, he stood up, walked to the door, opened the door, and walked out. The sky suddenly sprinkled light, and suddenly there was a bright white in front of him. Lu Chen narrowed his eyes subconsciously. At that moment, a thought suddenly flashed through his mind. Isn't the sky the same as usual? Why is it suddenly so dazzling today? Chapter 122. After the great earthquake in Kunlun, the mountain and the foot of the mountain were in a mess. Under the command of the headmaster, Reverend Idlemonth, coupled with the fact that the disciples of the famous sects were indeed outstanding, the situation of the Kunlun party was soon stabilized. Many chores, such as disaster relief, repairs, and so on, were carried out one by one, so no one panicked. However, the impact of this earthquake was very great. In many places, walls and houses collapsed. Although the casualties in the Kunlun party were not as high as in Kunwas city at the foot of the mountain, the troublesome thing was that because the epicenter of the earthquake was deep in the mountains, many places had mountain ridges shifted and rivers changed course. The consequences caused by this were also very troublesome. The most important medicinal garden of the Kunlun party under Baichao Tang, Liuxiang Garden, was one of the places that suffered the worst damage. In the originally flat area of the herb garden, there were many huge fissures in the ground, and at the same time, all kinds of oddly shaped rocks and soil were everywhere. They were formed by the huge distortion and compression of the ground during the calamity last night. Under such a natural disaster, the countless treasures and precious spiritual plants in Liuxiang Garden could be considered to be very unlucky. Large areas of the precious medicinal garden were directly destroyed. Many spiritual plants were either broken or damaged, all kinds of fruits and leaves fell, or all of them were buried in the soil by the uprooted rocks and sand. The most unfortunate thing was that the spiritual plants that just happened to grow above those unfathomably deep fissures directly disappeared after the disaster, and no one knew where they went. At present, everywhere in the Kunlun party was busy. The other halls had their own problems and couldn't take care of Liuxiang Garden. Baichao Tang also had many foundations, so they temporarily lacked manpower and couldn't send many people to help here. They could only first protect and rescue those extremely valuable and rare treasures in the deepest part of Liuxiang Garden. As for the periphery, they couldn't take care of it for the time being. At dawn, Black Dog came to the place outside the Liuxiang Garden. Compared with usual, the situation of this place, which was originally tightly guarded, looked very bad. Although the erected high walls and fences hadn't completely collapsed, collapsed cracks could be seen everywhere. It was almost as if there were none. Looking through the cracks, the situation in the grass garden was also miserable. The soil was tumbling and the plants were falling. It was like a grassland, and there were not many people around. Atsu craned its neck to look around for a while, then turned its head to look at the forest in the distance. Usually, that oxen would hide there and secretly peep at the fragrant garden, making strange movements and expressions. Atsu stood there and thought for a while. Then, he tiptoed into the grass garden through a crack. As soon as he entered the grass garden, the fragrance of spirit medicine in the air suddenly became much stronger, even stronger than usual. The reason for this should be the broken spirit grass and trees that could be seen everywhere, probably emitting their last breath. The scene was rather miserable. Atsu carefully looked around for a while. After confirming that there was no one nearby, it began to sniff and move forward, as if it was looking for something. In a medicinal garden like the fragrant garden, the most abundant thing was, of course, spirit grass. Therefore, it didn't take long for Atsu to see the spirit grass that was usually very precious. However, most of them were now buried in the soil, or broken and listless. Atsu looked at them for a while and didn't seem very satisfied, so it continued to move forward. The grass garden was quite quiet, but as time passed, some birds could occasionally be seen flying in from the surrounding forest and began to gorge themselves on the spirit grass that they had been longing for a long time. It seemed that this great earthquake was not a very bad thing for the birds and animals on Kunlun Mountain. Atsu glanced at the birds that were pecking at a few severed spirit grass nearby, and a look of contempt appeared in its eyes. Then, it barked a few times in that direction, which immediately startled the birds and made them fly up. After a while, they landed again and continued to peck. Atsu proudly turned its head and walked into the depths of the grass garden. As it walked, the fragrance in the air suddenly became stronger than before. Atsu seemed to have sensed it and seemed to be a little excited. It looked around and even began to trot. Not long after, a small mound that had just been formed by compression appeared in front of it. Atsu took a big stride and jumped on it. Suddenly, it only felt that everything in front of it was suddenly clear. Below the small mound was a rare piece of flat land that had not been damaged. It was a delightful sight of green grass. Especially in the center of this small piece of green grass, there was a unique spirit grass growing. Its stem and leaves were emerald green, and its head had red branches. There were 9 crystal clear, red, and purple fruits growing on it. The bursts of fragrance came from this spirit grass. Atsu grinned, and its eyes shone. On this day, the situation on Mount Kunlun had basically settled down by the time the afternoon arrived. 100 Herb Hall had also begun to mobilize manpower, including many odd-job disciples, to the flowing fragrance garden to begin rescuing the spiritual herbs. Of course, Lu Chen was also among them. Looking at the shape, strength, and size, there seemed to be one of the 4 footprints that was different from the others. It looked much lighter, and it looked a little strange. It looked like a person with a lame leg walking. The expression on Lu Chen's face suddenly became a little strange. He stood up and looked around. Seeing that there seemed to be no one paying attention to this place, he then looked down at the footprints left behind by the herb thief. The more he looked, the more he shook his head. He cursed, "Idiot, if I had known this would happen, I would have killed him and stewed him." With a cold snort, Lu Chen looked a little annoyed. He turned around and wanted to leave, but after a few steps, he suddenly cursed to himself again. He then turned around and walked to the edge of the pit. Looking around, he coughed and kicked the pile of soil at the side, sweeping a large amount of soil down and covering up most of the marks in the pit. Following that, he walked along the black soil footprints on the ground, and quietly stepped on the side of the footprints. Immediately, black soil could be seen everywhere, covering up the row of strange footprints. After doing this, Lu Chen shook his head and walked to the front of the garden, preparing to go back and report his losses. At the same time, he muttered in a low voice, so low that only he could hear it. I'll eat it when it's fat. I'll eat it when it's fat." Trekking over mountains and rivers, passing through forests and rivers, a black figure ran happily in the mountains of Kunlun after the great earthquake. Atsu held a huge ginseng in its mouth. The ginseng's roots were still sticky with soil, and the top of the ginseng had 9 red fruit ginseng ears. The ginseng fluttered in the mountain wind, like a flag of victory, unhindered. It ran all the way, as if it was especially energetic today. Its pair of dog eyes were bright and full of expression, shining as if it was full of hope for the future of its dog life. Running, 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 it saw the Dog Head Mountain. It came to the foot of this strange mountain that had once gathered countless celestial birds and auspicious beasts. The strange thing was that on this day, all the animals were gone, and the Dog Head Mountain looked a little deserted. Atsu was a little surprised and stopped to look around. It found that all the celestial birds and beasts had indeed left. Only on the top of the Dog Head Mountain, there seemed to be a huge body lying there, as if it was sleeping quietly. Atsu suddenly became excited and ran up the mountain. Its slightly lame hind legs made it look a little tired and a little funny, but it didn't care at all and just ran all the way up the Dog Head Mountain. Oxen was lying there with its eyes closed. It didn't react to the arrival of Atsu, as if it was still sleeping. Atsu carefully walked over, and then slowly put the huge ginseng in its mouth in front of Oxen's bull head. Then it took a step back, looked at Oxen, and wagged its tail a few times. Woof! Woof woof! Atsu barked a few times at Oxen. Chapter 123. Lu Chen saw Su Qingjun at the entrance of the meadow garden. That day, she was wearing a green silk dress and carrying a long sword on her back. She was young and beautiful like a blooming flower in the deep mountains, and people could not help but look at her. Even after the disaster, many people were busy coming and going, but there were still many young male disciples who stole glances at her standing beside Lin Sheng. Every handyman disciple who came in a hurry to report the damage looked like they could not wait to stay in front of her for a moment longer. It was good to be closer to her. However, at this time when everyone had something to do and their feet did not touch the ground, Su Qingjun stood quietly by the side, not talking or working, which seemed a little strange. But it seemed that everyone who passed by thought it was natural, and no one had any objections. Perhaps no one wanted to be nosy, or most people thought that young and beautiful girls were born with special privileges. When it was Lu Chen's turn, he walked in front of Lin Sheng and whispered his name and the location of the spiritual field. Su Qingjun looked over for the first time, and her eyes fell on Lu Chen's face. Lin Sheng flipped through the scroll in his hand and nodded. You have the red ambergris. What's the situation? It's gone, Lu Chen said honestly. Gone? Lin Sheng frowned, and Su Qingjun's face also darkened. Yes, it's gone. Lu Chen repeated himself and said, when I went over to take a look, the spirit field didn't suffer any damage, but the red ambergris in the field had disappeared without a trace. All that was left was a dug hole. At this point, Lu Chen paused and seemed to ponder for a moment before continuing. There are a few indistinct footprints of wild beasts in the spirit fields. It's possible that after the earthquake last night destroyed the surrounding high walls and defensive formations, those beasts snuck in and stole them. Lin Sheng snorted, and his face did not look good. He picked up the brush in his hand and drew a line on the scroll. Lu Chen clearly saw that it was on the line of the red ambergris, and he erased it completely. Of course, Lu Chen understood what this action meant, but at the same time, he also saw that there were 5 or 6 similar scratches on the scroll. He couldn't help but be startled, and subconsciously said in surprise, You actually stole so many? Lin Sheng wanted to say something but stopped. Perhaps he remembered that his identity and the insignificant handyman disciple in front of him were worlds apart, so he did not bother to say more. He just waved his hand and said, Go to the high wall and help now. Make sure the hole is repaired before dark. Lu Chen nodded and turned to leave. When he walked past Su Qingjun, he stopped and looked at her. Then, he shrugged at her, spread his hands, and smiled helplessly. Although Su Qingjun looked unhappy, she did not vent her anger on Lu Chen. She just nodded at him and did not say anything. After a moment of silence, she turned and walked away. Lu Chen looked at the pretty figure walking away and shook his head. He then went to the high wall at the edge of the grass garden and was ordered to repair the wall. As he picked up the bricks on the ground, he whispered to himself, It's so good to be young and beautiful. I don't even have to carry bricks. After dark, people went home one after another, like birds and beasts returning to their nests at dusk. The power of rules in the Kunlun sect, which had existed for 5,000 years, was vividly demonstrated. Even such a sudden earthquake could not change the rules of the Kunlun sect that had been passed down since ancient times. A black shadow sneaked out of the night, limping but agile. It ran all the way to the outside of Lu Chen's house. It first crouched at the door and found that there was light in the house, but no one opened the door. Then it sniffed around and went to the back of the house. Sure enough, everyone was busy with other things and no one had the time to repair the house. The small dog hole was still there. The black shadow suddenly became happy and then shrunk its head and rubbed against the inside. Not long after, it got in. But before it could heave a sigh of relief, it suddenly felt a gust of wind around it, and then its vision went black. A bag-like thing covered its head, then its entire body, and with a swoosh, it was lifted upside down. It heard someone scolding, "How dare you come back, you might as well eat dog stew today." Woof 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 woof. There was a series of whining and angry roars from the cloth bag. It seemed that the black dog was very angry and very angry. Lu Chen, who was standing, was unmoved. He smiled and threw the cloth bag to the ground, then stepped on it twice and said, "You're so capable that you've learned to be a thief." The big cloth bag on the ground twisted and rolled. After a while, Atsu struggled to climb out of it. Then, it barked happily and shook its body vigorously. Suddenly, a cloud of dust was seen flying. "Hey, hey, hey." Lu Chen waved his hand in the air and said a little angrily, "Stop shaking. Where have you been all day? Why are you covered in dust?" "Woof woof." Atsu barked. Lu Chen looked at it and suddenly smiled. He suddenly bent down and reached out his hand, but this time, he grabbed Atsu's neck and lifted it up. Atsu struggled in his hand and barked repeatedly. However, just as it was about to show its white fangs to intimidate Lu Chen, it heard Lu Chen say, "Open your mouth again and I'll stew you." Atsu immediately closed his mouth so tightly that not even the slightest gap could be seen, let alone his sharp teeth. Lu Chen snorted and grabbed it to sit on the bed. He pressed the dog's head and stared into its eyes, saying, "Tell me, how many things did you steal from the fragrance garden?" Atsu shook its head repeatedly. It looked determined and righteous. "Where did I put the pot for stew?" "Woof." Atsu made a prompt decision. It barked and jumped off the bed, wagging its tail at Lu Chen. Then, it stretched out its leg and pointed under the table next to it. Lu Chen looked at the black dog suspiciously. He walked over and pushed the table away. He took a closer look and saw that there was a piece of soil under the table that was originally in the shadow. It was different from the surrounding soil. Lu Chen looked at Atsu. Atsu was sitting next to him, sticking out its tongue and wagging its tail. Its eyes were shining. After thinking for a while, Lu Chen flipped his palm and a black dagger appeared in his hand. He did not care that the sword was covered in dust. He directly stabbed the dagger into the ground. Immediately, the soil flew everywhere. Not long after, he dug out a small hole and found a flower stem in the soil. There was a dark yellow flower on it. As soon as this strange dark yellow flower was taken out of the soil, a strange smell spread out. It was difficult to distinguish between the fragrance and the smell. In short, it was an indescribable smell. Lu Chen stared at it for a moment. Then, he snorted and said, "Anemone, you have good taste. You won't die from eating it." As he said this, he raised his head and stared at Atsu. He said, "What else?" Atsu shook its head like a rattle drum. "My pot, woof." Atsu extended its leg and pointed at the bottom of the bed. After working for a while, there were holes everywhere in the small room. Finally, there were a total of 6 kinds of spirit herbs on the table. They lay quietly under the dim candlelight. "Sit down." Lu Chen sat at the table and shouted at Atsu with a stern expression. Atsu ran over and squatted at his feet. It rubbed its head against Lu Chen's leg. Lu Chen was not moved at all. With a cold expression, he pointed at Atsu and said, "Do you know what you did today?" "Woof." Atsu's ears perked up and it tilted its head. It looked confused. Stealing public property at the expense of public interests. Lu Chen looked at the black dog with disdain and said, "I didn't expect you to be such a shameless dog." "Woof." Atsu barked again. Lu Chen snorted. His expression eased up a little. At the same time, he lowered his voice and said, "Listen, we're on Mount Kunlun. If you're seen or discovered by others stealing spirit herbs, you'll be dead. I won't be able to save you even if I wanted to. Do you understand?" Atsu shrank its head. "Don't do this again." Lu Chen frowned and looked at it sternly. Atsu hesitated for a moment and then nodded. It extended its head and gently rubbed Lu Chen's knee. Lu Chen turned around and looked at the valuable spiritual herbs and spiritual materials on the table. At a glance, almost all of them were at least 2-veined spiritual herbs, and there was even a precious 3-veined spiritual herb. He couldn't help but frown and say, "As for how to deal with these spiritual herbs," Atsu jumped up and ran towards the door. It then straightened its body and fiddled with the door latch. It looked like it was going to turn in the public property. At the same time, it heard the second half of Lu Chen's sentence. "It's not safe to hide them in this house." Atsu's body stiffened, and then he ran back as if nothing had happened. He wagged his tail at Lu Chen, and his dog eyes shone with the light of a confidant, as if he was telling Lu Chen that great minds think alike. Lu Chen pondered for a moment and said to himself, "I'd better put them there. Otherwise, if someone finds out that these spirit herbs are here, we will be in big trouble." Having made up his mind, he pulled the cloth bag on the ground and swept all the spirit herbs on the table into it. Atsu followed beside him, stretching its 2 front legs and lying on the table, looking at it eagerly. Lu Chen glanced at it and said, "You want to go in too?" "Woof." "Okay, come here." Lu Chen waved his hand. Atsu immediately ran over happily and jumped onto Lu Chen's body. Lu Chen smiled, he grabbed the sack tightly and suddenly pressed his hand on his chest. At that moment, the world spun, light and shadow blurred. A moment later, they had already fallen into that mysterious and ancient tree hole. Lu Chen stood up, poured out the spirit herbs from the cloth bag and identified them one by one. After looking at most of them, he put them aside. Only when he got the last spirit herb that was as thick as a baby's arm, white and tender in color, and shaped like a lotus root, he was stunned for a moment and shook his head. Black mud lotus. This thing can't be separated from water. Otherwise, the spiritual energy will dissipate in a short time. He glanced at Atsu and said angrily, "The pond where this thing was planted is not shallow. How did you dig this thing out?" He didn't care about Atsu's reaction. He frowned and thought for a moment. He seemed to be a little hesitant, but in the end, he still picked up the black mud lotus and walked to the edge of the puddle in the center of the tree hole. When the black mud lotus sank into the water and fell silently, the ripples spread out, disturbing the reflection of Lu Chen's face. Vaguely, the cluster of black flames in the depths of the water seemed to tremble slightly. After a moment, the black mud lotus fell into the puddle near the cluster of black flames. The water rippled and finally calmed down. Chapter 124. The follow-up measures for the Kunlun mountain earthquake were very effective. Both the mountain and the foot of the mountain quickly settled down. After the initial rescue, all that was left was to count the losses and mend the pen after the sheep was lost. Baichao Tang was one of the Kunlun party's branches that suffered the most losses. Among them, the fragrance garden, where many precious spiritual herbs and spiritual materials were planted in the open air, accounted for most of the losses. In the face of such a natural disaster, those delicate and precious spiritual herbs appeared particularly fragile and could not withstand the devastation of the force at all. The specific number of losses must be very large, but as for how much, as a servant disciple, Lu Chen was not qualified to know. However, just by looking at the tense faces of the senior Jinren of Baichao Tang who came and went in the fragrance garden these days, he could roughly guess the number of losses. Therefore, these days, all the foundation building and chi refining disciples of Bai Chao Tang were as silent as cicadas in winter. Each and every one of them followed the rules, for fear of bumping into those Shinran. On the contrary, the odd job disciples were more relaxed than usual. Firstly, the herb garden had been destroyed, so many people had nothing to do for the time being. Secondly, the disciples who were usually in charge of supervising the herb garden had all been summoned for questioning, so they didn't have time to care about them. Lu Chen felt that these days were pretty good. He got up early in the morning and went out with Atsu. Then the dog went to play by itself and disappeared for a day. He went to the fragrance garden to take a roll call, and the rest was pretty much idle. In the Kunlun party, which had always exploited the servant disciples, such leisurely days were rare. Lu Chen was in a good mood, so he wandered around. Anyway, at this time, there were no small leaders coming to supervise him, so he was very free. As he walked, he greeted and chatted with people along the way. Until he passed by He Changxing's spiritual field, he saw He Changxing sitting in the spiritual field, seemingly dejected. Lu Chen went over to greet him, then asked, "What's wrong with you? Why are you so listless?" He Changxing sighed and said, "The stone garlic I planted is gone." Lu Chen was stunned. He knew a little about stone garlic. This kind of spiritual herb was of the two-vein grade. It was full of medicinal power and could be used to refine several kinds of panaceas, so it was quite useful. However, its biggest characteristic was that this kind of spiritual herb was very gorgeous when it bloomed. It was said that it also grew overseas. It also had a name that sounded very powerful and awe-inspiring, but it was a little hard to pronounce. Lu Chen did not remember the specific name, but in the vast land of China, the cultivation world of the Middle Earth was just so simple, so it had an unusually down-to-earth name. Lu Chen patted He Changxing's shoulder with a smile and said, "And here I thought it was something serious. It's a natural disaster this time, and it's not your fault. Don't worry, you can rest for a few days. When we get back, Bai Chao Tang will naturally arrange for new spiritual herbs. We just need to cultivate them diligently." He Changxing bitterly smiled and shook his head. "You can't say it like that. I've already planted the stone garlic very well and was about to harvest it. I'm sure that the rewards I'll get will be great, but now it's all gone." He let out a long sigh and said with a bleak expression, "I just want to work hard and rebuild my family's reputation bit by bit. Why is it so difficult? Even God is against me?" Lu Chen was also speechless for a while. Looking at He Changxing's depressed and painful expression, he could only pat his shoulder again and casually comfort him before leaving. After he walked for a long distance, he occasionally looked back and saw that ordinary figure still sitting in the spiritual field with his head down. It was as if there was an invisible heavy burden on his shoulders, making He Changxing feel like he could not straighten his back. Life was still going on day by day. Although the natural disaster was terrible, the strength of people was equally tough and powerful. Rules and life were quickly restored. Bai Chao Tang quickly sent people to clean up the damaged spiritual fields, and new spiritual herb seeds or plants were distributed again. The leisurely days of the part-time disciples were over. Occasionally, they would look at the distant mountains. The towering Kunlun, deep in the mountains, was a place that was covered by clouds and mist all year round. When the weather was good, they could occasionally see a corner of the four strange peaks hanging high in the sky. It was the greatest yearning and dream of all the people who worked hard in the mountains. That must be a fairyland. That must be the most beautiful place in the world. When the sun rose, the clouds and mist were surrounded by fairy air. When the sky darkened, the mist still did not dissipate. The place called between the clouds and sky seemed to be so mysterious and beautiful forever. After midnight, it was the curfew time in the mountains of Kunlun. No one was still walking outside the house, except for the teams of the disciples on night duty who occasionally passed through the mountain paths. However, even the disciples on night duty would not go near the mist in the deepest part of the mountains of Kunlun. That was the most strictly regulated forbidden area in the entire Kunlun party. Among the four strange peaks in between the clouds and sky, 2 were occupied by the 2 perfected lords of divinity. The other two floating peaks could still allow Jinren Yuanying to set foot on them for cultivation. However, the place below between the clouds and sky, where the mist was thick all year round, was a place that even Jinren Yuanying could not set foot on. This rule was not known by ordinary people, and even if the high-level cultivators knew it, they would not say it. Just like that, it had existed silently in the Kunlun party for thousands of years. Late at night, the moon was bright and the stars were sparse. A full moon hung in the night sky, sprinkling its pure moonlight on the majestic undulating mountains of Kunlun. It illuminated the tall mountain tops, but it still could not shine through the incomparably thick mist. The four strange peaks of spring, summer, autumn, and winter were suspended in the sky above the mist. They were thousands of feet apart from each other, forming a rare spectacle in the world. Under the moonlight, the mist slowly drifted up and down, like a mysterious and calm sea. No one knew what secrets were hidden under the deep sea. A figure suddenly swept across the sky, like a lonely swan flying in the sky, lightly and freely descending into the mist. When he flew to the edge of the mist, his body suddenly stopped in the air. Under the moonlight, the strong wind in the sky was blowing fiercely, causing his clothes to flutter. It also illuminated his unusually tall and fat body, as well as his shiny bald head, which seemed to be able to reflect the bright moonlight. True Lord Tianlan raised his head and looked at the beautiful bright moon. His eyes were deep and calm, making it impossible to tell what emotions were hidden in them. Then, his gaze shifted slightly, looking at one of the four majestic and huge shadows high up in the sky. It was the Winter Peak, a world of ice and snow. His gaze seemed to penetrate all the darkness in the world, passing through the layers of obstacles and seeing the distant peak of the Winter Peak, which was surrounded by countless violent storms and snowstorms. For a moment, the depths of his eyes seemed to reflect the distant snowstorm, surging wildly, cold and murderous. After a moment, his huge body suddenly sank, straight into the depths of the mist. The moment he entered the thick mist, a chill immediately surged over, as if it could instantly freeze the blood of ordinary people. However, true Lord Tianlan seemed to turn a blind eye to this, and his whole body continued to descend. Then, thunder suddenly rumbled in the mist, and a few weird electric arcs suddenly lit up and darted over from all directions. However, every time they approached perfected Lord Tianlan, they would suddenly twist in a weird way, painfully turning into all kinds of hideous shapes in midair before disappearing into the mist without a sound. Then, there were restrictions that whistled and surged over like a tide, like demons and ghosts. Countless green gases surged out of the mist, as if they were nether spirits that were about to devour people. In the end, there were even corporeal evil spirits that pounced over viciously. However, all of this seemed to have no effect on true Lord Tianlan. He did not even look straight at them, and just descended silently, expressionless, as if nothing could stop him. Thus, all the obstructions scattered like smoke, leaving only an unwilling and angry roar behind him, which quickly melted into the dense fog that was as deep as the sea. The mist was so deep that it was unknown when he would reach the bottom, but in front of true Lord Tianlan, everything was like an illusion. About 5 minutes later, the mist in front of true Lord Tianlan suddenly dispersed a little, and a solid ground appeared underground. It was a deep valley, and there was a black disk with a radius of a few feet embedded in the ground. The black disk seemed to be made of iron, stone, and jade. It was unknown what exactly it was made of, but there were all sorts of strange runes carved on it. They were complicated and twisted, but also gave off an ancient and desolate aura, as if it was an extremely ancient object. On the black disk, in the depths of the mist, there was a figure sitting there quietly and alone. True Lord Tianlan descended slowly, right in front of that person. The world under the mist was unusually quiet, as if it was isolated from the world, and no sound from the outside world could be heard. There did not seem to be any ordinary mountain breeze here. Not far away from the black disk was a gray mist that was so dense that it seemed corporeal. True Lord Tianlan flicked his sleeves and sat down slowly. Then, he raised his head and looked at the person opposite him. In the dim light, in this lonely world, the person opposite him looked unusually old and haggard. His body and face seemed to have lost all the luster of life. His wrinkles were deep, and his skin was dry and cracked. Even his breathing sounded a little labored. It was a very, very old little old man. He did not even seem to be half the size of true Lord Tianlan's fat body. He looked as if he had reached the end of his life and was about to die, like the last withered leaf in the cold winter wind and snow. True Lord Tianlan looked at the haggard old man quietly and did not say anything. His eyes flickered slightly, as if there were some complicated emotions in them. The haggard old man who had been in meditation with his eyes closed seemed to have woken up from his slumber at this moment. He slowly opened his eyes and looked at Tianlan. His gaze was as bright as the moonlight in the firmaments, as if all his spirit energy and mental strength had been gathered in his eyes. That gaze seemed to be able to see through one's heart and everything in the world. True Lord Tianlan bowed slightly and said calmly, "Long time no see, senior brother." Chapter 125. Everyone knew that there was only one person in the Kunlun party who deserved to be called senior brother by perfected Tianlan. It was Bai Chen, another famous perfected cultivator in the divinity transformation stage of the Kunlun party. According to the genealogy of the Kunlun party, Bai Chen and Tianlan, the two rare geniuses, were both disciples of Elder Tianhong, the founder of the Kunlun party in the past. To be able to teach two perfected cultivators in the divinity transformation stage who stood at the peak of the human cultivation world, Elder Tianhong was certainly a great figure himself. It could even be said that the Kunlun party had stepped into the golden age again after Elder Tianhong was born. It had prospered all the way until today, passing on the torch and dominating the West continent, looking down on the vast land of the divine land. Now, the famous figures of the past had naturally passed away, and the majestic atmosphere of the magnificent Kunlun did not diminish in the slightest. Naturally, the two perfected cultivators had contributed the most. However, the relationship between Bai Chen and perfected Tianlan had always been rather subtle in the Kunlun party. Hakushin Jinkuan was the eldest disciple of Elder Tianhong. He was a peerless genius who had risen to fame the earliest. His cultivation was profound, and he had been regarded as the pride of the Kunlun party since the very beginning. When Elder Tianhong was still alive, he was already recognized as the natural successor of the leader of the Kunlun party. Perfected Tianlan, on the other hand, was a newcomer who was born 100 years later than Hakushin Jinkuan. Thanks to Elder Tianhong's sharp eyes, he was selected from the mundane world. Then, he burst out with shocking talent, and his cultivation level soared. In the end, he became the youngest perfected cultivator in the history of the Kunlun party. These two peerless figures were like the two peerless geniuses of the Kunlun party. They brought honor to their ancestors and made countless Kunlun disciples feel proud of them. They also made the Kunlun party look down on the world and become one of the first-rate cultivation sects in the world. After ancestor Tianhong passed away, Hakushin Jinkuan took over the position of the leader of the Kunlun party. However, from then on, an indescribable secret rumor had been secretly circulating in the Kunlun party. It was said that in Patriarch Tianhong's later years, his favorite disciple wasn't his eldest disciple, Bai Chen, but perfected Lord Tianlan. One of the greatest proof was that Patriarch Tianhong had passed his Daoist name, Tian, to his youngest disciple, Tianlan. Tianlan, Tianlan, Tianlan. This Daoist title was extremely grand, and it was said that Patriarch Tianhong had personally given it to perfected Lord Tianlan. From this, it could be seen that Patriarch Tianhong had high hopes for perfected Lord Tianlan. However, no one knew what the truth was back then and what the person involved was thinking. The truth was that Hakushin Jinkuan took over the position of sect leader and passed it to his disciple, perfected Idle Month, many years later. Perfected Lord Tianlan exerted his strength in the outside world and focused on Zhengxianmeng. He became one of the 6 perfected lords of the Immortal Alliance and was equally famous and prestigious. From another perspective, Bai Chen and Tianlan, the 2 perfected lords, complemented each other from the inside and outside. This allowed the Kunlun party's reputation to rise to a higher level and reach a peak in the past 1,000 years. Bystanders were watching and discussing the twists and turns in this matter, but who could see clearly? Just like how the majestic mountains of Kunlun would not care about the voices of insignificant ants. Under the thick fog, the two top figures of the Kunlun party sat opposite each other on a black disk. Not far away from them were layers of gray and murderous fog. Not a single sound could be heard, as if the two of them were the only ones left in the world. Hakushin Jinkuan stared at Tianlan. After a while, he slowly said, "It seems like your cultivation has improved again." Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and said, "Senior brother's eyes are like a torch. Everything in the world is like dust and has nowhere to run." The corners of Hakushin Jinkuan's mouth twitched slightly. His dry skin seemed to reveal a smile, but the smile seemed a little shaky and ugly because he was too old. Contrasting with his aged voice, it seemed to indicate that this old man who stood at the peak of the cultivation world and had experienced countless years seemed to have reached the end of his life and did not have much time left. "We haven't seen each other for 10 years, right?" Hakushin Jinkuan seemed to be a little emotional. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded and said, "That's right. After the battle in the barren valley in the Lost Lands, senior brother hated me for killing too much and went into seclusion to cultivate, unwilling to see me." Hakushin Jinkuan looked up at Tianlan. After a while, he suddenly smiled and said, "You're dissatisfied with me, aren't you?" Perfected Lord Tianlan also smiled, his chubby face full of smiles. He said, "Senior brother, you must be joking." Both of them fell silent. No one spoke for a long time. After not seeing each other for 10 years, the two of them, who were related to each other, seemed to have nothing to say. It was a little unfamiliar, and there was an inexplicable awkward silence. After some time, Hakushin Jinkuan said lightly, "Let's go down." "Yes," Perfected Lord Tianlan replied. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through the originally silent fog. No one knew where it originated from or where it was going. Wisps of mist swirled up and drifted about, forming strange patterns in the air that gradually formed an ancient and desolate painting. The runes on the black disk revolved around the two figures, one fat and one skinny, and lit up one after another. Rays of light seemed to shine from the ancient past into the present, slowly lighting up and emitting a boundless energy. The light shone on the two perfected lords' faces and the depths of their eyes that were as deep as the ocean. A thunderous sound rang out from the depths of the ground. The black disk began to spin slowly and the light danced along with it, gradually increasing in speed. Suddenly, there was a sharp whistle and the fog that filled the sky suddenly froze. A moment later, the black disk suddenly descended and went straight into the depths of the ground. Darkness surged over and devoured all the light. Only the gazes of the two people seemed to be afraid of even the darkness, not daring to approach. They looked through the shadows of nothingness and stared at each other. The speed at which the stone disk descended became faster and faster. In the air, it even let out a chilling, shrill, piercing sound. The descending passage seemed to be unimaginably deep. After a long time, they still could not see the bottom. It was as if the black disk was going to bring them straight into the deepest part of the ground and rush towards the legendary dark ghost world. Unbeknownst to them, the surrounding atmosphere suddenly became tense. Suddenly, lightning flashed and thunder rumbled in the darkness, striking down from all directions. There were also countless ghosts and ghosts, making all kinds of sinister appearances, roaring and howling as they pounced on them. Two invisible light shields appeared around the two perfected monarchs at the same time, blocking all the restrictions a foot or so away. The only difference was that Hakushin Jinkuan's light shield was as white as snow, while perfected Lord Tianlan's light shield was as red as fire. The rumbling sounds did not stop, and the ghosts and shadows seemed to cover the sky and the earth. The most terrifying scenes in the world seemed to be hidden in the depths of the Kunlun Mountains. But in the eyes of the two perfected lords, it seemed that none of these could shake their Taoist heart. They only looked at each other indifferently and coldly. The flames were cold and murderous, isolating and burning all the ghosts. Gradually, the sudden thunder and roar quieted down. The terrifying phantoms disappeared in the darkness, as if they had finally given up on the fruitless entanglement with the two people. Meanwhile, the black disk was still descending rapidly towards the bottomless underground world. "We haven't seen each other for 10 years. Senior brother, your snow wind scripture has improved again. Congratulations." Perfected Lord Tianlan's voice suddenly came from the darkness. I'm just struggling at death's door, Hakushin Jinkuin said lightly, sounding a little tired. When he looked up at his junior brother, there seemed to be a strange light in his eyes. I can't compare to you. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and said, Senior brother, you're being modest. I still remember when Master was alive, he taught me several times. He only said that I was impatient. If I didn't change my nature, I would never be able to achieve great things. He also said that senior brother has a strong will and is a model for my cultivation. I must learn from you, Master. For the first time, there was some change on Hakushin Jinkuin's calm face. Even in the depths of his eyes that seemed to be as cold as snow, there was a faint ripple of wind and snow. Boom! Suddenly, a loud sound came from beneath them. The black disc suddenly shook violently, but it stopped, as if it had finally reached its destination. At some unknown point in time, in the seemingly endless darkness, a ray of light shone over. The light came from the front. A huge passage appeared in front of them. The walls were made of ancient and huge rocks, and the huge dome was more than 1,000 feet high. It was like a towering temple that one couldn't see the sky at a glance. It was completely silent, without the slightest bit of vitality. In this mysterious place hidden deep underground, everything seemed to be silent. Bai Chen and Tianlan stood up, looked around, and then walked forward side by side. Compared to this terrifyingly large passageway, their figures seemed abnormally small. Even the stone path beneath their feet seemed to be more than 10 times larger than a mortal. The light that shone down from above flickered, as if it had experienced a long period of time. Even time seemed to have frozen here. The sound of their footsteps traveled far and wide. They had been walking for a very long time. Until they saw the end of the huge passage in front of them. The light there dimmed, and darkness reappeared. Shadows and shadows flickered, as if they had reached the boundary between light and darkness. There was a door there. It was a tall, huge, majestic, and ancient door. The mottled marks of time were left on the door, as if it was quietly waiting for something. The two perfected lords walked over and stopped in front of the huge door. Then, they looked up at the same time. The door was like a mountain, looking down at them coldly. Darkness surged in from all directions and condensed at the door, pushing the light away. Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly asked Hakushin Jinkuin, "You're awake?" "No." Hakushin Jinkuin shook his head and said, "I turned over." "Oh." Chapter 126. Standing at the intersection of darkness and light, the two true monarchs' faces seemed to flicker between bright and dark, looking somewhat uncertain. They exchanged a few simple words, and then did not speak again. After a while, Perfected Lord Tianlan slowly walked forward into the darkness. Looking at his broad back, Hakushin Jinkuin stared silently for a while before following him. Everything was very quiet, even when they stood in front of the huge stone door. The darkness was like a tidal wave, like a vast ocean. It seemed to drown the two of them, and they even felt like they were standing in the depths of the ocean. The silence seemed to have reached an extreme. Then, an extremely faint voice suddenly floated over from the depths of the darkness. It was illusory, but it also seemed ancient. It was so light and long that it was like a breeze blowing through the darkness. It sounded like thunder rolling through the darkness. Their robes fluttered despite the lack of wind. The voice and the strange breeze quietly passed by, reverberating and fluttering. It gradually became clearer, but it was coming from behind the huge stone door. It was as if a long slumber had occurred. An unimaginable existence in the darkness was breathing peacefully. Perfected Lord Tianlan turned to look at Hakushin Jinkuin. Bai Chen nodded slightly. A moment later, Tianlan reached out and pressed his hand on the huge stone door. A deep voice suddenly sounded from beneath the stone door. It sounded like the call of a devil, but also like the tremors of the earth. Bit by bit, the door slowly opened. Darkness assaulted them. It surged like a raging tide. The strange light barrier lit up around the two of them at the same time. Instantly, lightning flashed and thunder rumbled. It was as if countless terrifying forces had collided with the light barrier at the same time, emitting terrifying screeches. The distorted lightning emitted a bright light that illuminated their faces. One could see their solemn expressions as if they were facing a great enemy. After a while, the lightning slowly calmed down, and the surrounding darkness fell silent. However, behind the stone door, the incomparably deep darkness that seemed to be devoid of any light still existed there quietly. The two of them walked forward into the depths of the darkness. The huge stone door rumbled and slowly closed behind them, shutting off the endless darkness and isolating it from the world. Although 100 Herb Hall had suffered quite a bit of damage in the earthquake, the hall's remedial work was still very effective and swift. About 10 days later, all the potholes and mounds in the flowing fragrance garden, including the damaged high walls and fences, had been completely repaired. The spiritual fields had been tidied up once again. The precious spiritual herbs that had escaped the disaster continued to be carefully nurtured, while the unlucky spiritual herbs that had died or went missing were replanted with new spiritual seeds. Everything seemed to be on the right track again, and the days returned to their former calm and regular routine. It was the same for Lu Qin. He was given a new spiritual plant and started to cultivate it diligently like before. He Changsheng and the other Chor's disciples were in a similar situation. However, this peace didn't last long. About 20 days after the Kunlun earthquake, a piece of news suddenly came out and spread throughout the Kunlun party in an instant. Even Kunwas city at the foot of the mountain was stirred up in the blink of an eye. Su Qingjun, a disciple of the Kunlun party's Masato Kihara, successfully advanced to the Jin Dan realm and became the youngest Jin Dan friar in the history of the Kunlun party. A mere 22-year-old Jin Dan friar. His future prospects were so great that it was simply unimaginable. Even the two lofty deity transformation stage sovereigns hadn't reached this level of talent and speed. Although there was still a world of difference between the Jin Dan realm and the deity transformation stage sovereigns, and there was still a long and endless road to walk, and although since ancient times, there were countless unimaginable geniuses who fell halfway on this road and sighed at the sight of the sovereign position, there was always hope, wasn't there? There was a lot of hope, wasn't there? Kunwas city was in an uproar. The Su family was in an uproar. In a short period of time, there were countless wedding invitations, and the people who came to congratulate them broke the threshold. Even the servants of the Su family went out with their chests puffed out, as if they had more confidence. As for Kunlun, it was, after all, a famous cultivation sect, so it was somewhat different from the secular world, so there wasn't such an exaggerated scene. However, it was said that on that day, Masato Kihara was so ecstatic that he got drunk, which was rare in recent years, and his loud laughter spread far and wide. The elders of the older generation sighed with relief or some other emotions, while the younger generation of Kunlun disciples were basically in awe and admiration. For a moment, Su Qingjun became the most popular figure in the Kunlun party, and she also became the topic of discussion for countless people after their meals. Among them, the most discussed topic was whether this young woman could become a new generation of deity transformation stage sovereigns in the future. Just thinking about it was enough to stir one's heart. In Liuxiang Garden, Su Qingjun also became the center of everyone's topic. When Lu Qin accidentally heard his companions talking about this matter, he recalled Su Qingjun's appearance a few days ago, and he secretly sighed with emotion in his heart. That red ambergris ginseng seemed to be very important to her advancement, but unfortunately, it was lost in an accident. But even so, Su Qingjun still succeeded in breaking through. This kind of genius with great luck was really too different from ordinary people. When Lu Qin saw Su Qingjun again, it was already several days later. That day, as usual, he was working in the Liuxiang Garden's grass garden when he suddenly heard a noise in the distance. It seemed like there was a dispute, and someone was making a ruckus over there. This was a rare thing. Usually, the handyman disciples worked honestly. Occasionally, they would slack off in their spare time, but they never dared to make a ruckus in public like this. It should be known that the people in charge of this area were all 100 Herb Hall's Taoists. Whether it was prestige, cultivation, or strength, not one of them wasn't a high and mighty figure. If they didn't like him, it would be too easy for them to take care of an odd job disciple. This was strange, and after the ruckus started, it did not subside. Instead, the noise became louder and louder. It seemed that the quarreling got angry and did not care anymore. This alerted even more people. Many of the odd job disciples and direct disciples who were passing by saw this scene and walked over to spectate. Lu Chen was also curious, so he walked over. When he got closer to take a look, he was suddenly startled. He saw that the quarreling parties were not the handyman disciples working in the Liuxiang garden, but 3 people on one side and 5 personal disciples on the other. It seemed like they were all cultivators in the qi refining realm. But beside them, there was a handyman disciple either lying down or kneeling on the ground. Among them, the kneeling handyman disciple's face was swollen red, his body was trembling, and his face was filled with humiliation. It was He Changsheng. The surrounding people were discussing spiritedly. There were already people who recognized the 2 sides. In addition to the words of cursing, it didn't take long for Lu Chen to roughly understand what was going on. The Kunlun disciples who were quarreling on both sides were all children of influential families in Kunwa City. On one side of the trio was the Su family of Kunwa City. All 3 of them had already reached the peak of the qi refining realm when they were in their teens. They were young and had good innate talents. Even if they could not be compared to Su Qingjun, that kind of peerless genius, they were the rising stars of the younger generation that the Su family highly valued and had high hopes for. They had the title of Su family's 3 heroes. As for the 5 people on the other side, they belonged to 3 influential clans, Lin clan, Lu clan, and Shen clan. These 3 influential clans possessed extraordinary strength in Kunwa City. They had known each other since childhood and could be considered good friends. As for today's matter, it was actually a young man from the 3 heroes of the Su family, Sumo. He learned from his talented older sister Su Qingjuan's method. Some time ago, he also left a precious 2-striped spiritual plant in the flowing fragrance garden and asked Bai Chao Tang to plant it on his behalf. Coincidentally, among the 5 people on the other side, there was also a young man from Lin family who placed the same kind of spiritual plant in the garden and then asked someone to plant it. That person just happened to be He Changsheng. That spiritual plant was Lycoris. Planting the same kind of spiritual plant on both sides wasn't a big deal, but after the great earthquake in Kunlun, He Changsheng's Lycoris, which was originally planted very well, suddenly disappeared. This kind of encounter happened many times in the flowing fragrance garden. Most people thought it was because the high walls collapsed and the formation failed, causing wild beasts in the forest to sneak in and steal, so they couldn't do anything about it. He Changsheng's heart ached endlessly because of the reward he was about to receive, and that young man from Lin family could only accept his bad luck. But on this morning, when He Changsheng inadvertently walked past the spiritual field planted by that young man from Su family, he discovered that the Lycoris in the spiritual field were a bit abnormal. To be exact, they were growing too well. The odd job disciple who planted the Lycoris for Sumo was called Zhang Ji. His talent was slightly worse than He Changsheng's, and he wasn't as diligent as He Changsheng, so the Lycoris he planted were never as good as He Changsheng's. But on this day, when He Changsheng saw the Lycoris in his field, he found that it was almost exactly the same as the one he had planted before. He Changsheng immediately made a fuss. Of course, Zhang Ji denied it, and at the same time, he spoke sarcastically. He Changsheng was extremely angry and fought with him. After the news spread, very soon, Sumo and the others, as well as the young disciple from Lin family named Lin Kuangyi, all rushed over. After hearing the news, Lin Kuangyi knocked Zhang Ji over with one palm, pointing out that the Lycoris was his. How could this Sumo agree? Both sides immediately quarreled, and in the chaos, He Changsheng was also kicked over and ordered to kneel on the ground. Lu Chen looked at He Changsheng, who was kneeling on the ridge of the field from afar. Looking at his lowered head and his flushed face, Lu Chen was silent for a moment. The 2 young men in the field were all from aristocratic families and had been spoiled since they were young. In addition, they were young and vigorous, so the quarrel became louder and louder. The more they quarreled, the angrier they became. In the end, they actually started to fight. This time, it was a complete mess. Although these disciples were not very strong, they were still much stronger than ordinary people. For a moment, everyone retreated. Not long after, the situation tilted in the favor of the Lin family. After all, the three heroes of the Su family had fewer people. After a moment, Sumo, who was the leader, shouted angrily, "Call my sister here, call my sister here." Someone at the side shouted loudly, "I've already called her, young master, don't worry." Lin Kuangyi and the others were furious. They looked back, but found that the crowd was in a mess. How could they find out who was shouting? So they continued to shout, and the two sides were in a mess. Lu Chen stood at the edge of the crowd. Suddenly, he felt a faint cold wind behind him. He looked back and saw that woman standing behind him. Her eyes were as calm as autumn water, bright and clear. She glanced at his face and stopped for a moment. "It's you?" she said. "Lu Chen." Lu Chen answered. "Oh." She nodded and said, "I remember." Chapter 127. Lu Chen smiled and said, "Senior Marshal Sister, you have a good memory." Su Qingjun glanced at him. She didn't feel shy, but she seemed a bit embarrassed that she forgot the name of the person in front of her. At the same time, a series of shouts came from behind the crowd. Lu Chen coughed. For some reason, he recalled He Changxing's humiliated appearance just now. He originally wanted to step aside, but he stopped and smiled at Su Qingjun. "Right, I forgot to congratulate Senior Marshal Sister for advancing your cultivation and attaining the Jin Dan Great Path." Su Qingjun nodded with an indifferent expression. It seemed she had heard such words too many times recently and was numb to it. However, the shouts in front of her piqued her interest. She glanced in that direction. At this time, Lu Chen said, "I'm ashamed to say this. Back then, you said that the red ambergris ginseng would be very useful for breaking the realm, so I also carefully cultivated it. Unfortunately, that kind of accident happened. I'm really sorry." Su Qingjun was startled for a moment, then she shook her head and said, "This can't be blamed on you. The earthquake is a natural disaster, and the wild beasts can't help but steal it. It's the will of the heavens." Lu Chen thought that the black dog was nothing but a fart of heaven's will. However, at this moment, he had the intention of delaying it so that the youngsters of the Su clan could be taught a lesson. He revealed a guilty expression and sighed, saying, "Even so. Sigh, let's not talk about it. Fortunately, Shiji Su, your talent is outstanding. Even without the red ambergris ginseng, you were still able to break through to the Jin Dan realm. Congratulations." Su Qingjun said, "No, I still use the red ambergris ginseng." Lu Chen was stunned. "What? But the red ambergris ginseng is gone, you." Su Qingjun said, "Oh, that's just a small matter. Although the red ambergris ginseng is precious and rare, it's not to the point of being unique. Before I broke through, I sent someone to the biggest shop in Kunwa City and bought 2 stalks. Their age and medicinal effects are better than the previous one." "How much?" 22,000 spirit stones. Lu Chen stared fixedly at Su Qingjun. He saw that her expression was calm, as if this was only natural. After a while, he smiled bitterly and nodded. "Congratulations, congratulations." Su Qingjun politely nodded to him and said, "Thank you." Lu Chen took a step back and stood to the side, allowing Su Qingjun to walk past. Then he looked into the distance, but all he could see were the mountains rising and falling, the sky high and the earth high. After a while, he suddenly cursed in a low voice. *CK them. As Su Qingjun walked into the crowd, the first person to approach her suddenly became silent. Then, he consciously moved to the side and looked at her with a strange gaze. Soon, more and more people became aware of it. The originally noisy crowd quickly quieted down, and the path also moved faster and faster, allowing Su Qingjun to walk in. Bang! Sumo staggered backward and fell to the ground. She rolled twice and just happened to lie down in front of a pair of beautiful and slender feet. At this moment, one of his eyes was black and one side of his face was swollen. He looked like he had just been beaten. Sumo seemed to be a bit dizzy from the beating. He staggered and raised his head. After a while, he saw the beautiful face in front of him clearly. He was stunned for a moment before he suddenly shouted, big sister, quickly come and save me." There was a commotion in the crowd. Someone said in a low voice, "She actually came." Su Qingjun frowned and looked at Sumo's face with a slightly gloomy expression. The few people who were still fighting at the side also stopped in shock and quickly separated. Just now, in the fight between the two sides, although everyone was Qi refining disciples and their cultivation was not much different, Lin Kuangyi's side had 5 people while the Su family only had 3. In the end, they still suffered a loss. The other 2, Su Qian and Su Wen, were also swollen. It seemed like the 3 heroes of the Su family were more like the 3 bears of the Su family. And Lin Kuangyi's side of 5 people saw Su Qingjun suddenly appear. For a moment, they also felt a bit guilty and did not dare to be arrogant. As for Zhang Ji, who was lying on the ground, and Yi Changxing, who was still kneeling on the ground, no one paid any attention to them. "What happened?" Su Qingjun asked Sumo. Among the 3 bears of the Su family, Sumo was her biological younger brother. Su Qian and Su Wen were considered cousins in terms of seniority, and their bloodlines were also extremely close. So seeing the 3 like this, Su Qingjun was not happy in her heart. However, she had always been educated and knew etiquette, so she first asked about the cause of the matter. "Big sister, it was that Lin guy who bullied people." Sumo shouted and began to blame Lin Kuangyi's group with her saliva flying everywhere. On the side, Su Qian and Su Wen also hurried over to help and told the story from beginning to end. On the other side, Lin Kuangyi's group became angry and couldn't help but open their mouths to argue. Both sides quarreled, and it looked like there was anger rising again. After a while, suddenly Su Qingjun lightly shouted, "Shut up." The 3 Su family brothers immediately shut up. On the other side, Lin Kuangyi's group looked at each other and also quieted down. Su Qingjun glanced at the stone garlic in the spiritual field and saw that the spiritual plant was indeed very beautiful. After a moment of silence, she looked at Lin Kuangyi and didn't say much. She only asked, "Do you have proof?" Lin Kuangyi's group of 5 looked at each other in dismay and were momentarily speechless. In this quarrel, everyone took advantage of the chaos to fight. Young people were fooling around and no one cared. Whoever had the bigger fist was the one in the right. But if they really started to reason, these young people from aristocratic families weren't really stupid. How could they not know that there were some things that didn't make sense? That stone garlic was planted by me. I know, I recognize it. Suddenly, a voice shouted. Everyone was startled and looked over. They saw that it was Yi Changxing, who was kneeling on the ground, shouting loudly with his neck straight. The faces of Sumo's group darkened and they glared at Yi Changxing. On the other side, Lin Kuangyi's group was overjoyed. They didn't care so much and started to make a ruckus. They repeatedly said, "That's right, that's right. He was the one who planted the stone garlic. Other than him, no one else can recognize that spiritual plant. That's right. In this grass garden, this person is the best at planting stone garlic. If he says there's a problem, then there must be a problem." All kinds of discussions surged. Su Qingjun slightly frowned and glanced at Yi Changxing. And behind the crowd, Lu Chen also looked over from afar. He didn't say anything and only shook his head slightly. "You mean, that stone garlic is the one you originally planted?" As soon as Su Qingjun said this, the surroundings became quiet. Even Lin Kuangyi's group didn't say anything. This kind of quiet atmosphere made Yi Changxing a little nervous. At the same time, he looked at Su Qingjun's exceptionally beautiful face. His breathing seemed to become a little hurried. After a while, he finally said, "Yes, I planted it." "Do you have proof?" Su Qingjun asked. He Changxing was startled and loudly said, "That was planted by me. I recognize it, I recognize it." The surrounding crowd was silent. At this moment, many people seemed to have thought of something, but no one spoke. Su Qingjun shook her head. Her tone was still calm, but the meaning in her words was very clear. "This won't do. You need proof. You can't say that something is yours and then it must be yours, right?" She pondered for a moment and said, "Material evidence or witness is fine. You can choose any one. As long as it makes sense, I will let second brother return the stone garlic to you." As she said this, she looked at Lin Kuangyi and said, "Junior brother Lin, do you think it's okay for me to deal with it like this?" Lin Kuangyi smiled bitterly and said, "Okay." With Jean Dan Fryer standing there, and one with a bright future, he dared to say no. Moreover, Su Qingjuan's words from the beginning to the end were reasonable. He couldn't say anything more. Proof. When everyone's eyes focused on He Changxing's face, he was confused and murmured, "Material evidence? Witness? This, but it was really planted by me." The crowd was silent. The Su family was looking at him. The Lin family was looking at him. Everyone was looking at him. It was as if the heavens and earth were looking at him. He knelt in the crowd, but it was as if he was outside of the cold world. After a long time, Su Qingjun didn't say anything. Instead, Sumo, who was standing beside her, sneered and said, "Hey, that guy, do you have proof or not? Quickly say it." He Changxing's face turned red. He stammered, "Material evidence? Where is the material evidence? You don't believe my words? Witness, yes, witness." He suddenly jumped up, looking wild with joy. He loudly said, when I planted the stone garlic, many people saw it. You, right? You all saw me planting the stone garlic, right? Didn't I plant it very well? Didn't I plant the best stone garlic in the fragrance garden? What do you think?" There was a slight commotion in the crowd, but it quickly quieted down. No one spoke, and no one whispered. When he pointed at others, especially the odd job disciples with the same status as him, those people quietly avoided him or remained silent. He Changxing was stunned. His face was ashen, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. But at this moment, his eyes suddenly lit up, as if he saw something. After a moment of hesitation, he suddenly shouted and rushed over. The crowd moved aside. Su Qingjun and the others also looked at his actions. He Changxing rushed into the crowd and stopped in front of Lu Chen, whose face had changed slightly. Then, they saw him laughing loudly. He grabbed Lu Chen's hand and dragged him into the field. Then, he hugged Lu Chen's hand tightly and looked at Lu Chen with eyes full of expectation. With a slightly trembling voice, as if he was entrusting his life's hope, he said, "Lu Chen, you are the best friend of mine, and we talk the most. Tell me, you can testify for me. That stone garlic, is it mine or not?" In a moment, everyone's eyes fell on Lu Chen, including Su Qingjun, who also looked at him with a slightly surprised expression. Beside her, the 3 brothers of the Su family and the 5 people of the Lin family also looked at this lowly odd-job disciple with complicated expressions. Lu Chen expressionlessly looked around, and then turned his head, quietly looking at He Changxing. That man was looking at him with eyes full of gratitude and hope, as if he was grasping at a life-saving straw. He tried his best to show a trace of a smile, and then softly said, "Lu Chen, help me, tell me. Lu Chen said, "I know him, but I don't usually interact with him, so I am not familiar with him." Su Qian's eyes lit up. "You are not familiar with Zhangji?" "Not familiar. That is to say, you rarely come to Zhangji's land?" "Almost never." Su Qian clapped his hands and said, "Then have you seen the stone garlic that Zhangji planted?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment. After a while, he said indifferently, "I don't have any impression of it. I should have never paid attention to it." Su Qian laughed, looked around, and then said with a slightly complacent expression, "Then let me ask you one last time. Are you absolutely certain that this stone garlic in front of you is not the one that Zhangji planted himself?" Lu Chen was silent again. This time, everyone around him seemed to hold their breath. He Changsheng was a little nervous, staring closely at Lu Chen. Lu Chen lowered his eyes, as if he was carefully thinking, but also as if he was comparing in his heart. After a while, he raised his head, looked at everyone in front of him, and then said expressionlessly, "No, I can't be sure." Boom! The surrounding crowd suddenly seemed to explode, the sound waves rolling over. Everyone showed all kinds of different expressions. And in the field, Lin Kuangyi and the others looked at each other, revealing a bitter smile, as if they had already expected this result. And the three Su family brothers were happy. Only Su Qingjuan's face seemed to show a subtle and strange expression, looking deeply at Lu Chen. You, a hoarse shout, with disbelief and anger, came from beside Lu Chen. Suddenly, a pair of hands rushed over and fiercely pushed Lu Chen, causing him to stagger back a few steps and fall to the ground. It was He Changsheng. His face looked a little twisted, his eyes bloodshot. He looked fiercely at Lu Chen, as if the last hope in his life had been shattered by Lu Chen. "You are not human." He roared, and shouted at Lu Chen, "How dare you say that? You clearly know that the stone garlic is mine." Lu Chen silently stood up, looking at He Changsheng. That gaze was as indifferent as the mountain wind blowing, almost without any emotion, no fear, no sympathy. Deep in his eyes, the gaze was as deep as the sea, reflecting only a silent darkness. "I am just speaking the truth," Lu Chen said indifferently. "What truth? What you said is bullshit." He Changsheng was still shouting. He seemed to have lost control, his emotions were collapsing, even tears were flowing down his face, pointing at Lu Chen, then pointing at everyone around, roaring, "You are all like this, you don't believe me, obviously I am a good person." He screamed loudly, suddenly turned around and ran away, rushing out of the crowd, disappearing in the blink of an eye. When he had just rushed out, the Su family brothers seemed unwilling to let him go, wanting to stop him, but Su Qingjun coldly glanced at them, in addition to He Changsheng's frenzied expression, like a madman, so the Su family brothers gave up. At the side, Lin Kuangyi and a few others discussed in low voices. Then, he walked to Su Qingjuan's side and smiled apologetically. "Senior Sister Su, we were indeed in the wrong today. It's all our fault for trusting that bastard and causing a misunderstanding with Brother Su and the others. Later, I will definitely apologize, just..." "There's no need." Su Qingjun suddenly interrupted him. "Let's end this matter here." Lin Kuangyi was a bit surprised, but then his face lit up with joy. He said with a smile, "That's great, thank you, Shiji Su." Su Qingjun glanced at him and said indifferently, "Junior Marshal Brother Lin, Su family and Lin family aren't enemies, on the contrary, our two families have been friends for several generations. If today's matter were to be spread back to Kunwa City, I don't need to say anything, I'm afraid Uncle Lin won't be happy. Have you thought about this?" Lin Kuangyi was startled, his face turned pale, and he hastily said, yes, what Shiji Su said is right, little brother was wrong. In the future, if Shiji Su needs little brother's help, just tell me, little brother will be honored to be able to help you." Su Qingjun sighed and said, "Forget it, you can go." Lin Kuangyi and the others repeatedly agreed. They didn't dare to stay here for long, so they hastily left. Su Qingjun looked back at Lu Chen, who was still standing there. She wanted to say something, but she hesitated. A trace of apology flashed across her eyes, but in the end, she didn't say anything. She just slightly nodded at him, then called out to Sumo and the others, and left. On the prairie, the crowd of onlookers also began to gradually disperse, but He Changsheng's crazy appearance just now was still deeply imprinted in their hearts. Soon, only Lu Chen was left in the crowd. He stood there silently for a moment, and just when he was about to leave, he suddenly saw a young girl standing not far from him. It was Exan. She looked around and saw that there was no one around, so she hastily ran over, gently pulled Lu Chen's arm, and said in a low voice, "Brother Lu, don't be angry, I saw everything just now, those people, I'm fine." Lu Chen interrupted her words, and smiled. Xian blinked, and said, "Really?" Lu Chen looked at the young girl in front of him with a smile, looking at her beautiful face under her soft long hair, and his gentle eyes hid a trace of concern. "I'm fine, really," he said softly. "Okay." Xian immediately became happy, then pointed to the front, and said, "Marshal Uncle Yan is still waiting for me there, I'll go first." Lu Chen smiled and nodded, and said, "Okay, you go." Xian smiled and turned to leave, the mountain wind blowing up the corner of her clothes, like a flower fluttering in the world. This scene, this matter, quickly passed. Some people took it as a bolt from the blue, thinking that the sky had broken, while others thought that it was just a small matter like the waves of the river and the sea. From that day on, He Changsheng and Lu Chen became enemies. When they occasionally met on the road, he would stare at Lu Chen with an extremely resentful look, as if he wanted to kill Lu Chen with his eyes. Of course, Lu Chen clearly felt this blatant hatred, but he felt a little bored and a little funny. Of course, he didn't show it on the surface. Most of the time, he just passed by He Changsheng indifferently and expressionlessly. A few days later, somehow, this matter was suddenly known by the people in charge of Bai Chao Tang. It was said that a big shot couldn't stand it after knowing it, and told the people in charge of Bai Chao Tang. As a result, Bai Chao Tang suddenly became angry. The three brothers of the Su family, Lin Kuangyi, and the other four were all fine, but only the handyman disciples were punished. He Changsheng, Zhang Ji, and Lu Chen were called to the supervisor, and they were scolded heavily. In the end, regardless of the twists and turns, Zhang Ji and He Changsheng were the cause of the trouble, and 20 spiritual stones were deducted directly. Lu Chen was only caught to testify, so he was not to be blamed. So, the fine was waived, and he was released after a scolding. From then on, He Changsheng seemed to become more and more abnormal. Every day, he would ramble on and on. Some people even saw him sharpening a sharp blade and carrying it with him. It was as if he was about to go crazy. And according to people living near him, these days, He Changsheng said the most, "I'll kill you, I'll kill you." Chapter 129. This morning, Lu Chen took Atsu out. As usual, in order to ensure the safety of all kinds of precious herbs in the herb garden, no birds or beasts were allowed to enter the garden. Therefore, Atsu never went there with Lu Chen. Basically, they parted ways as soon as they left the garden. Lu Chen went to the herb garden to work, while Atsu ran out to play for a day. It took care of its own food and drinks, and only came back when it was dark. This method of letting go was, of course, less troublesome for Lu Chen, but Xian often nagged about it. She was always worried that something would happen to Atsu when it wandered outside alone. However, Lu Chen did not care about her worry and ignored it. Atsu seemed to like this kind of life very much. It ran out to play all day and seemed to be very comfortable and happy. Therefore, in the end, Xian could only accept this fact. At most, when she occasionally came to visit Atsu, she would secretly bring it some of its favorite meat bones. At the door of the house, Atsu turned around and called out to Lu Chen as a greeting. Then, it ran away like a wisp of smoke. No one knew where it went to play today. Recently, Atsu seemed to like to go out, but no one knew where it went. Lu Chen was too lazy to care about it and walked all the way to the fragrance garden. After entering the herb garden and coming to the spiritual field, Lu Chen began his day's work in the breeze with a fragrant smell. However, this day did not seem to be lonely, because he had only worked for a while when Xian appeared with a smile on her face beside his spiritual field. She waved at him and said with a smile, "Brother Lu, good morning." Lu Chen patted the soil on his hands, walked to the edge of the field and sat down. He smiled at Xian and said, "I say, you are too idle. I only see you wandering around all day." Xian glared at him and said, "What do you mean?" Lu Chen said, "I remember you are at the Rock Mountain." Why do I see you at the fragrance garden every day these days? Aren't you slacking off? Exian chuckled and revealed a proud expression. She said, you don't understand. Marshal Aunt Yen Luo has recently been transferred to Flowing Fragrance Garden to manage things here. She brought me here too. Oh, no wonder. Lu Chen nodded and said with a smile, it seems that Marshal Aunt Yen likes you very much. Of course, who doesn't like this lady? Exian playfully stuck out her tongue. Just as she was about to say something, her expression suddenly froze. The joke she was about to say was stuck in her mouth. Her eyes looked behind Lu Chen as if she had seen something surprising. For a moment, she couldn't say anything. Lu Chen was slightly surprised and turned his head to look. He frowned slightly. He saw that a few dozen feet behind him, He Changxing was walking past. His pace was not fast, but his eyes were fiercely staring in Lu Chen's direction. Perhaps because he did not sleep well last night, He Changxing's eyes were a little bloodshot. His gaze was full of resentment. He looked at Lu Chen as if he had seen his father's murderer or his mortal enemy. He could only be described as gnashing his teeth. Exian couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine when he occasionally glanced at the people around Lu Chen with a look of disgust and hatred. Lu Chen stood up expressionlessly and took a step forward to stand in front of Exian, blocking He Changxing's gaze for her. At the same time, he stared coldly into He Changxing's eyes. His gaze met He Changxing's without the slightest intention of backing down. He Changxing seemed to become more and more angry when Lu Chen looked at him like this. His chest rose and fell rapidly, and his face revealed an indescribable anger. It was as if he could not believe that Lu Chen dared to look him in the eye without the slightest bit of guilt or shame. But Lu Chen just stood there calmly, silently looking straight at him with a bit of coldness. After a while, He Changxing turned around and strode away. Brother Lu, this person, how can this person be like this? Exian poked her head out from behind Lu Chen. Looking at He Changxing's back, there was still some lingering fear in her heart as she asked Lu Chen. Lu Chen shook his head and said, it's probably because he hates me. Exian was startled for a moment and said, is it because of the fight over the stone garlic that day? Yes. How can that matter be blamed on you? Exian shouted. Looking at her pretty face, it seemed that it was somewhat pale from anger. She said, that stone garlic was Sumo's. The ones who beat him and humiliated him were also the people of the Su family. The one who insisted on standing up was him. Even if we take a step back, it was Lin Kuangyi who forced him. Su Qingjuan's sister Su stood up and said a few words. What she wanted was proof, but he couldn't produce it. Everyone stood up and spoke, so why does he only hate you? Yes, why does he hate me the most? Lu Chen said to himself. After a while, he turned to look at Exian. He saw that the girl's chest was still heaving up and down. It seemed that she was not light. He couldn't help but feel a little warmth in his heart. All right, sit down. Lu Chen smiled and pulled her arm. He said with a smile, I'm not even this flustered and exasperated. Why are you so angry? No, this doesn't make sense. I just feel wronged for Brother Lu. Exian pouted and complained. Lu Chen looked up at the sky. There were a few white clouds floating in the blue sky. After a while, he said to Exian, actually, I told you the reason. Ah, what is it? Exian was startled. It's because I'm weak, Lu Chen said faintly. Su Qingjun is a peerless genius. There's a world of difference between her and mortals. She's not someone he can have delusions about. The three brothers, Sumo, Su Qian, and Su Wen, are from the Su family. Their influence is enormous. In addition, Su Qingjun has just advanced to the Jin Dan realm. He Changxing is courting death by provoking them. Lin Kuangyi and the others are also in a similar situation. Even if the Lin family and the Qin family can't compare to the Su family, it's really too easy for them to crush a part-time disciple like him. Lu Chen looked at Exian and said calmly, He Changxing's ancestors were from an aristocratic family in Kunwa City. I'm afraid he knows a thing or two about these things. So, even if he hates them, he doesn't dare to provoke them. Xian clenched her teeth and looked at Lu Chen. She said, so, no matter how you look at it, I'm still the weakest. We're all part-time disciples, and I don't have any aristocratic family background. Isn't it the safest and cheapest way to vent his anger on me? Lu Chen smiled and said, everyone sees him acting like he's crazy now. In fact, that person's heart is very clear. Shameless. Xian spat. Her face was full of anger. She said huffily, if you have the ability, then go find the main culprit. I saw it clearly that day. He deliberately pulled you to testify for him. In the end, you didn't help him by telling the truth, so he actually hates you? If he really dares to go find those people from the Su family, I might think a bit more highly of him. He's really a coward. Lu Chen sat quietly for a while, then said, in fact, I also didn't expect him to be this kind of person. These days, the weak are already so cowardly that they don't dare to threaten the strong. So, they only dare to pile their hatred on the weak, thinking they can vent their anger in this way. They think they can become valiant in this way. Don't you think it's ridiculous? It's really disgusting. Xian frowned and said with a face full of disgust. Then she shook her head and sighed, saying, Brother Lu, why do I feel that, ever since I met you, I've always heard these not so good things. The more I hear, the more I feel that the world is always dark and there's no light at all. Lu Chen laughed and couldn't help but pat Xian's head. He said with a smile, that's because you haven't seen these things since you were young. I told you to broaden your horizons, but you actually don't want to. Xian covered her head and hit Lu Chen's arm. She complained, don't pat my head, I've become stupid. It's not that I don't want to, it's just that I feel uncomfortable listening to it. Lu Chen looked at her deeply, which made Xian feel a little unnatural. She said, Brother Lu, why are you looking at me like that? Lu Chen thought for a moment and said, actually, although there are many bad things in this world, I used to think that the whole world is that dark you mentioned. But after so many years, I don't think it's like that. There are still some very good things in this world. Xian's eyes lit up. She said, what are they? Lu Chen looked at her and said with a smile, for example, when you smile, you're very beautiful. It's like the sun is shining on you. Xian was stunned for a moment. After a moment, her cheeks suddenly flushed red. She jumped up and stammered, what did you say? Lu Chen said with a smile, can't I say you're beautiful? Ah. No one knew what Xian muttered, but she suddenly stamped her feet. She looked at Lu Chen with a mixture of joy and anger, then she turned around and ran away. Lu Chen shook his head with a smile. He got up and returned to the spiritual fields, ready to continue working. But before he could bend down, he suddenly heard the sound of hurried footsteps. He looked up and saw that it was Xian running back with a red face. Lu Chen said with a smile, what's wrong? I'm telling you, even if you're happy to hear it, I won't say it again. Shoo shoo shoo. Xian's face became even redder. She said angrily, Who wants to hear it again? I forgot to tell you something. Lu Chen said with a smile, what is it? Say it. Xian's eyes seemed to be drifting. She didn't dare to look Lu Chen in the eye. She just glanced to the side and said, I went back to my home in Kunwa City yesterday and brought some pretty good tea. Do you want some? Yes, Lu Chen answered without hesitation. Xian seemed to be a bit happy and giggled. But soon after, she seemed to remember something and said, right, there's one more thing. Yesterday, when I was about to leave the city, a fatty suddenly stopped me and asked me to tell you that the blue butterfly you ordered last time has arrived. He asked you to go down the mountain to get it when you have time. Lu Chen's expression suddenly turned cold. Chapter 130. Brother Lu, what is blue butterfly do? Exian looked at Lu Chen and asked in confusion, I've never heard of it before. Is it a rare mystical material? Lu Chen's pupils shrank slightly. After a moment, he took a deep breath and his expression returned to normal. He smiled and said, oh, that's not a mystical material. It's just a kind of fine wine. It's not worth much. It's wine. Exian shrugged. It was obvious that she had no interest in things like wine. She bid farewell to Lu Chen and turned to leave. However, at this moment, Lu Chen called out to her. Exian said, Brother Lu, is there anything else? Lu Chen was silent for a moment and said, Exian, you have to be careful in your daily life. Don't trust others too easily. Exian was a little surprised and said, Brother Lu, what do you mean? Is there something wrong with the person who asked me to pass on the message? That's not it. Lu Chen shook his head and seemed to smile bitterly. He then coughed and changed the topic, saying, there are too many bad people in this world. You're young and you look a little silly. I'm afraid you'll be taken advantage of. Hey, who's silly, who's silly? As expected, Exian was immediately led astray by his words. She started to shout and huff. Lu Chen nodded with a smile and said, anyway, that's roughly what I meant. Oh, right, he Changxing from before. Stay away from him if you don't have anything to do. If he really attacks me like a mad dog and injures you by accident, it'll be terrible. Exian nodded and said, I know. Don't worry. She turned and left. Her footsteps were light, and she seemed to be in a good mood. Lu Chen stood behind her, looking at her receding figure. He stood silently for a moment, turned around, and suddenly scolded in a low voice, damn fatty, what are you trying to do? At the foot of the Dog Head Mountain, Atsu trotted all the way over. It had been many days since the earthquake. Many of the celestial birds and beasts that had fled here on that day had unknowingly returned, and once again occupied their orderly positions on the strange mountain top. When Atsu walked over, many animals saw him. The birds chirped, the ferocious beasts roared, and an ostrich accidentally kicked Atsu's butt as it passed by. There were even more exotic beasts who remembered how pathetic Atsu looked when he was thrown off the mountain peak. They all looked at Atsu with disdain and schadenfreude as he carefully walked up Dog Head Mountain. The huge figure was still shrouding the top of the mountain. Rhinoceroses, fierce tigers, lions, giant elephants, and red-crowned cranes danced in the air. There were even more exotic birds and beasts that Atsu had never seen or heard of before. It was unknown how so many of them had gathered in Kunlun Mountain. Among them, there were quite a few ferocious beasts. When Atsu passed through their territory, they either provoked, obstructed, or intimidated him, causing Atsu to look back at every step, for fear that he would accidentally become food in the stomachs of others. With great difficulty, Atsu slowly climbed to the top of the Dog Head Mountain. The journey was really exhausting. Atsu was so tired that he was half hanging out his tongue and panting. After resting for a while, he looked back and saw a huge oxen lying on the top of the mountain. Its eyes were half closed, as if it was dozing off. Atsu waited for a moment, and then he started to stride towards the green ox. At the same time, the entire mountain was deathly silent. The gazes of countless immortal beasts were looking towards the peak of the mountain, and they were waiting for the next shadow to be tossed down. Atsu wagged its tail and slowly walked to the side of Oxen, which was like a small mountain. It still seemed to be a little cautious, and in the silent atmosphere of the mountain, it seemed to be a little nervous. Woof. Atsu's bark was a little low, and there was some hesitation in it. It was more like a question. At this moment, a black figure suddenly swept across the sky. It was the thick and abnormally agile tail of Oxen. Immediately, all the beasts on the Dog Head Mountain became excited. Lions and tigers raised their heads, and celestial birds spread their wings. All of them widened their eyes and stared at the top of the mountain. After a while, the tail gently fell and stroked the soft fur on the back of the black dog in front of Oxen. It patted it and then retracted it. Oxen opened and closed its eyes, and then yawned. All the beasts on the mountain were dumbfounded. Atsu was stunned for a while, then suddenly jumped up and ran to the top of the mountain. It shook its body fiercely at all the beasts on the bottom of the Dog Head Mountain, and then cried out in joy, "Woof woof woof woof! Woof woof! Woof!" Everyone on the top of the mountain was silent. Only the mountain breeze blew past, and the black dog stood on the top of the mountain, looking particularly awe-inspiring. At noon, Lucien found an excuse to go down the mountain and went to Kunwa City. Passing through the bustling long street, he seemed to turn a blind eye to the liveliness around him and went straight to the city wall. However, this day, he didn't directly enter the city wall. Instead, he circled the street outside the alley twice and waited for another hour before he entered the alley and arrived at the Black Hill Pavilion that was completely deserted. The fat old ma was lying on his beloved recliner drowsily. When he heard footsteps, he jumped up and said without opening his eyes, "Sir, look around. Our store has a lot of spiritual materials, and the price is cheap." "Oh, it's you." Lu Chen looked at him and said with a sneer, "It's me. Why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" Old Ma let out a big yawn and sighed, "I thought there was finally business coming to my door." Lu Chen spat and said, "Dream on. Since this store opened, how many business deals have you made? Tell me." Old Ma coughed and said with a stern expression, "Let's not talk about the past. We have to look forward. Besides, what's wrong with dreaming? What if it succeeds?" Lu Chen stretched out a finger and gestured at him. Then, his expression slightly darkened. He stared at Old Ma and said, "Tell me clearly, why did you suddenly drag that little girl, Exian, into this?" Old Ma shrugged and said, "I have something urgent to talk to you about, but you just don't go down the mountain recently. Isn't there no other way?" Lu Chen said without any trace of politeness, "Nonsense. You are so well informed and have so many connections. You can investigate whoever you want in the Kunlun party. There are at least dozens of spies in the mountain. Who did you call to tell me that I can't do it? Why did you have to drag an innocent girl into this?" Old Ma looked at Lu Chen and said with a smile, "What's wrong? I've never seen you so concerned about others." Lu Chen snorted and said, "Don't provoke me. We've been playing these things for a long time. I'm just telling you that Exian has nothing to do with this matter. Don't drag her into this." Old Ma looked at him and said indifferently, "Is that what you mean?" Lu Chen seemed to have thought of something. He frowned and said nothing. Old Ma then smiled and said, "Those spies you mentioned are the same as you. If there is any danger, they will also put their lives in my hands. So, if I have to choose someone, of course I will protect my people. That girl from the family was doomed from the day she met you. Why are you pretending to be stupid? Are you addicted to being Brother Lu in front of her? Do you really think you are a good person who can protect her for a lifetime?" Lu Chen suddenly raised his head and looked at Old Ma with cold eyes. However, Old Ma did not dodge. He just looked at him coldly. The atmosphere in the shop was icy cold. After some time, Lu Chen suddenly said, "You would never talk to me like this normally. What happened?" The fat on Old Ma's face trembled. It seemed as if he was suddenly annoyed. He said angrily, "Nonsense. I've always been this straightforward." Lu Chen did not look at him anymore. He turned to look around the shop and muttered, "There doesn't seem to be any assassins lying in ambush. Maybe they are hiding outside?" After pausing for a moment, he suddenly took a step in front of Old Ma and stretched out his hand to grab the fat on his face. Old Ma cried out and struggled free. "What are you doing?" he asked angrily. "I am checking to see if you have been forced to eat poison to harm me." "Bah! Bah!" Old Ma's spittle almost landed on Lu Chen's face. "Go to hell. You are the one who ate poison, the kind that rots your heart, lungs, and intestines." Lu Chen clapped his hands and looked at Old Ma with contempt. "Remember to wash your face more next time. I can't stand a fat man with oily face." Old Ma kicked, but Lu Chen easily dodged it. Old Ma cursed and pointed to the back hall. "Let's go there," he said grumpily. "Why?" "He wants to see you." Lu Chen suddenly fell silent and looked at Old Ma. The anger on Old Ma's face disappeared at that moment. He looked at Lu Chen with concern. After a while, he sighed and said, "Go." Lu Chen nodded and walked towards the courtyard at the back of the hall. After taking 2 steps, Old Ma suddenly said, "Oh right, you should tell that Miss E yourself when you get back." Lu Chen stopped and did not look back. "What is it?" Old Ma said indifferently, "The girl is young and naive. She trusts others too easily. I only said a few words and she believed me. She didn't even think to ask me how I knew about your relationship with her." Lu Chen was silent. After a while, he slowly shook his head. He did not say anything and walked to the back hall. After passing through the long and narrow alley, he saw the familiar square courtyard. However, unlike before, this time, Lu Chen saw the figure of that person at first glance. When that abnormally fat and broad figure sat in the small courtyard, it even gave off the illusion that the courtyard was almost filled to the brim. His loose robe, sitting cross-legged, and shiny bald head all spoke of this person's identity. A bird flew over the courtyard by chance. It seemed to be tired or curious. It slowly fluttered its wings and landed on his bald head. It did not seem to feel any hostility, but it also seemed to feel that it was only a stone under its feet. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked ahead and smiled. He waved at Lu Chen and said gently, "You're here. Come and sit." Chapter 131. Lu Chen took a few steps forward and sat down on the stone steps in the small yard. He was a little far from Perfected Lord Tianlan, but they could still see each other clearly. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him without any anger on his face. His eyes were gentle and there was even a hint of a smile on his lips, as if he was looking at a stubborn and naughty child. "How have you been?" he asked Lu Chen with a smile. Lu Chen said, "Not bad. Is there any progress on that matter?" Lu Chen glanced at him and said lightly, "Old Ma knows all these things and he must have told you clearly. Why do you still ask me?" Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and said, "He is not you after all. There might be some differences when he conveys the message in the middle. Besides, I still want to hear you say it again." Lu Chen frowned and said after a moment of silence, "I still don't have any clues. I didn't find any traces of the devil cult's activities on Kunlun Mountain either. I can only slowly investigate it now. I randomly set a few targets and asked Old Ma to investigate them first and see what the results are." Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded with an indifferent expression and said, "I got it. But I'm a little curious about the 2 people you want to investigate. Why did you choose these 2 girls instead of others?" Lu Chen said expressionlessly, "There's no reason. I just met them a few times and it was convenient." Convenient. Even though Perfected Lord Tianlan was experienced and knowledgeable, he couldn't help but smile bitterly at this moment and said, "It seems that those 2 girls are a little unlucky to know you." Lu Chen looked up slightly and said, "If they are the spies of the devil cult, then they are really unlucky." "All right." Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and waved his hand. "Anyway, you just do it. I believe in you." Lu Chen smiled, then glanced at him and said, "Why do you have the time to visit me today? I remember that you have been staying in Zhengxiameng for a while, right?" Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "I've been back for a while now and I've always wanted to meet you. However, it's really inconvenient on Kunlun. Now that you're at the foot of the mountain, it's rare for you to come down. That's why it's been delayed until today." He smiled and said, "Actually, if you don't come today, I'll be leaving tomorrow." Lu Chen was startled for a moment, then said, "No wonder Old Ma was so anxious." Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled without saying anything. Lu Chen frowned and suddenly said, "You've been back for a while and you came back secretly without anyone in the sect knowing?" His eyes suddenly brightened and sharpened as he looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan. "Did something happen in the sect?" "Something came up." "What is it?" It's not convenient for me to tell you. Lu Chen's eyes flashed and he looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan. Oh, you can't even tell me? Perfected Lord Tianlan thought for a while and then shook his head. It's still hard to say. However, I might be able to tell you when you're done with this and I take you in as a disciple. Lu Chen looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan and the light in his eyes grew brighter. He suddenly stood up and said, seems like it's a big matter. Yes, it's a big matter. And it's a big secret of the Kunlun party. I think so. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and said, why? Are you very curious and want to know? Yes. Lu Chen answered crisply, what secret is there in the Kunlun party that the fiend cult coveted it so much that they even bet the fate of the entire sect on it? There must be something behind it. It might be helpful in finding the fiend cult spy. I want to know. Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment as though he was weighing the pros and cons in his heart. Then, he smiled apologetically and said, I'm sorry, I still can't tell you. However, I can tell you that only senior brother Bai Chen and I participated in that matter. I believe it has nothing to do with the fiend cult spy that you mentioned. Lu Chen's expression changed slightly. After a while, he shook his head slowly and said, you two perfected lords are highly respected. It's naturally impossible for you to collude with the fiend cult. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled without saying anything. He looked at Lu Chen and a dark light flickered in the depths of his eyes like gentle waves on the ocean. The bird chirped and didn't fly away even after a long time. It seemed to be reluctant to part with Perfected Lord Tianlan's huge bald head. It looked around and occasionally pecked at the shiny skull with its beak. However, Perfected Lord Tianlan looked calm as though he did not care about the bird at all and did not feel the pain at all. Is there anything I can help with? Perfected Lord Tianlan asked Lu Chen. Lu Chen asked, you want to help me? Shouldn't I? I was the one who asked you to do this. If there's anything I can help with, I can also do something in passing. There are a few people. Help me kill them, Lu Chen said. Perfected Lord Tianlan said. That's not very good, right? After thinking for a while, he said, are you sure that those people are suspected to be fiend cult spies? No, I just don't like them. Lu Chen said and then added, just like you. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled bitterly and sighed. I shouldn't have told you the truth back then. Lu Chen sneered. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him with gentle eyes that still seemed to be doting. However, after a while, he suddenly said, Little Lu, I realized that you're a little different from before. Lu Chen said, what? You don't seem to be afraid of me anymore. Lu Chen sneered and said sarcastically, look at what you're saying, as if I've been afraid of you for so many years. Didn't I say the same thing to you a few years ago? Perfected Lord Tianlan shook his head with a playful look in his eyes. He looked at Lu Chen and said, that's not it. Back then, even though you were always joking around in front of me, you still had some respect for me. Come on, why would I be afraid of you? You're not afraid of me. You respected the word, Perfected Lord, deep in your heart. At that time, I could tell that you, like almost all the cultivators in the world, had an instinctive fear and admiration for the supreme position of Perfected Lord, this realm, and the strength that this title represents. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled but his eyes were unusually bright as he looked at Lu Chen. It was as if he could see through his body and see through his organs. That's the supreme realm that billions of cultivators can never reach in their entire lives. For thousands of years, everyone respected it. Everyone is the same. I can tell. Ha! Lu Chen laughed, but there seemed to be a slight change in his expression. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him and said slowly, but when we met in the Barren Valley previously, I felt that something was wrong. However, I couldn't figure it out no matter how I thought about it. His eyes flickered slightly and he said gently, it was only when I looked at you just now that I suddenly understood what was wrong. The smile on Lu Chen's face suddenly disappeared as he looked at the fat man coldly. Perfected Lord Tianlan pointed at Lu Chen and said calmly, "You're not afraid of me anymore. To be exact, you, an ordinary cultivator with such a low cultivation base, actually no longer have that instinctive reverence for the strength of a soul formation perfected lord." Lu Chen said coldly, "I don't understand what you've been talking about." Perfected Lord Tianlan narrowed his eyes and stared at Lu Chen as if he was re-examining him. After a while, he suddenly said, "God's subduing mantra, right?" Lu Chen's face suddenly turned pale. When Atsu ran out of the forest, it looked at the sky. Although it was still bright, the sun was already setting in the west. It should be evening soon. Today, on the Dog Head Mountain, it was very happy and excited. It finally blended in with those immortal birds and strange beasts that usually had their eyes on the top of their heads. It made it feel proud and elated. Even its footsteps when it ran back seemed to be lighter than usual. It was a pity that dogs couldn't hum, otherwise, Atsu would definitely be whistling all the way back. From afar, it saw Lu Chen's house and Atsu ran all the way there. However, when it was about 100 feet away, Atsu suddenly stopped. It saw a figure walking back and forth outside the house. It was a man with a strange expression on his face. His face was a little red and his eyes were a little unfocused. His chest was heaving up and down as if he was gasping for breath. There was also a hand that was hidden in his chest as if he was grabbing something. That person kept looking around, but more often than not, he was staring at Lu Chen's house. He was mumbling something, but it was unclear what he was saying. He just kept pacing around the house. Atsu was a little puzzled and stared at that person for a while. But apart from his suspicious behavior, that person didn't seem to be doing anything else. Atsu waited for a while and saw that the sky seemed to be a little darker. After thinking for a while, it felt that it should go back first. So, it ran towards the house. When it ran past that person, it could see that the man glanced at it, but he didn't seem to care, nor did he do anything else. Atsu was a little relieved. It ran to the door and called twice, but the house was quiet. No one answered. Behind it, the man suddenly stopped and turned around to look at it. Atsu didn't pay attention to the movement behind it. Unfortunately, it found that there was no one at home. But now, this kind of thing was no longer a problem for it. Wagging its tail, Atsu ran to the back of the house. The small dog hole there was now its exclusive passage. But at this moment, suddenly, there was a call from behind it. "Little dog." Atsu's footsteps paused for a moment. It stopped in front of the dog hole and looked back. It saw that it was the strange man from before. He didn't know when he had walked over, but he was standing not far behind it. There was a strange smile on his face, and he smiled at it. His teeth were very white. Deathly white. Chapter 132. What does this have to do with the deity vanquishing spell? Lu Chen asked. Perfected Master Tianlan looked at him and shook his head. There are thousands of cultivators in the world. 90% of them are stuck below the Jin Dan realm for the rest of their lives. Among the rest, less than 10% can break through the Yuanying realm bravely and diligently. As for those in the divine transformation realm, people can only look up to them like gods. Lu Chen smiled and said, "Do you think you're a god?" "Of course I'm not a god. At most, I'm just a fat man with a slightly higher cultivation." Perfected Master Tianlan smiled and said, "But people who haven't reached this realm won't have such thoughts." Lu Chen suddenly shut his mouth. "I've seen many people in this world, but there's only one kind of person who doesn't fear me." "What is it?" Lu Chen couldn't help but ask. "A divine transformation realm perfected master with the same cultivation as me." "You're getting more and more ridiculous." Lu Chen forced a smile and looked down at his body. Then he said, "Divine transformation realm perfected master, do I look like one?" "Of course not." Perfected Master Tianlan's smile gradually disappeared. Then he looked at him meaningfully and said, "That's why I'm very curious and curious." "What is it?" Or did you see or encounter something that made you throw away the fear of a divine transformation realm perfected master? Lu Chen's Adam's apple gently moved up and down. Under perfected Master Tianlan's bright eyes, he suddenly felt a penetrating chill. However, perfected Lord Tianlan quickly continued, so I thought about it carefully and thought about what you had encountered in the past 10 years. In the end, after thinking about it, I realized that you had stayed in that small mountain village for the past 10 years. Your cultivation had been crippled and you had concealed your identity. There shouldn't have been any accidents. So, the accident happened before you went into seclusion. He stared into Lu Chen's eyes for a long time and said gently, so, it must be the deity vanquishing spell, right? That secret spell is a secret of the devil cult. Only a few devil cult elders know the trick to it. But according to what happened in the Battle of Barren Valley, and what you mentioned to me a few days ago, I think those people probably wanted to use a secret spell to open the sky and cross the boundary to attract the magnificent divine power to forcefully advance to the next level. Lu Chen said coldly, they failed. It's because of you that they failed. The atmosphere in the courtyard suddenly turned cold. Lu Chen remained silent, but the breath in his chest seemed to be a little unstable, and even his breathing became a little heavier. However, Supreme Lord Tianlan continued as if he didn't care about anything. So I was thinking that something I don't know happened to you when the god-vanquishing spell was running. These things are very important. They can even make you throw away your fear of perfected cultivators. Look. Yes, it's the look in your eyes. Supreme Lord Tianlan looked into Lu Chen's eyes gently and said, you clearly know that you are no match for me, and you know that there is a world of difference between your cultivation and mine. But when I exposed the secret in your heart, your first reaction when you looked at me just now was not to find a way out or beg for mercy. The corner of Lu Chen's eyes twitched slightly. He said coldly, then what do you think I am doing? Supreme Lord Tianlan said indifferently, you are looking at me. When you looked at my body, you were subconsciously examining something, as if, you were thinking, how to kill this person. Am I right? Supreme Lord Tianlan asked Lu Chen. The courtyard was silent. After a while, the little bird on the bald head suddenly jumped up and flapped its wings to fly into the sky. The two looked up at the same time and watched the little figure disappear into the distance. After a while, they retracted their gazes and looked at each other again. This is the funniest joke I have ever heard in my life. Lu Chen said expressionlessly. Supreme Lord Tianlan thought for a while and said, it is quite funny. After saying that, he actually opened his mouth and laughed 3 times at Lu Chen. Lu Chen lowered his head slightly, and then slowly, once again sat down on the stone steps. After a while, he suddenly said, damn Baldy, if you don't believe me in your heart, then I can't do this anymore. A cold breeze blew through the courtyard and seemed to blow the chill into the depths of one's heart. After a while, Supreme Lord Tianlan shook his head gently and said, of course I still believe you, little Lu. Just like what I said to you in the Barren Valley, you are the only person in this world that I trust the most. Lu Chen raised his head and saw that the abnormally tall and sturdy fatty was staring at him with a gentle gaze. What I said just now wasn't to blame you, nor did I say that you really wanted to kill me. It's just that I really want to know what you saw when you cast the god-subduing incantation that suddenly made you have such a state of mind. All these years, you have never kept any secrets from me. I feel that I know everything about you. But now that something that I actually don't understand has suddenly happened, I really want to know. Supreme Lord Tianlan smiled and said, I think it's not that hard to say. Lu Chen sat where he was in silence. The surrounding light was faintly dim. After a while, he looked up at the sky and stood up. It's late, I have to return to the mountain. Supreme Lord Tianlan looked at him quietly. After a while, he nodded and said gently, then go. I will return to the immortal city tomorrow. Be careful here in Kunlun Mountain. Lu Chen nodded at him and then turned to walk back to the passageway. Supreme Lord Tianlan seemed to sigh softly and closed his eyes. A dim light flickered in the depths of his eyes and a trace of complicated emotions seemed to flow through them. However, when Lu Chen walked to the entrance of the passageway, he suddenly stopped and did not look back. He just stood where he was and said calmly with an almost emotionless tone, "If I say that I have already told you everything that happened when the God-subduing incantation happened back then, even the smallest details, will you believe me?" Supreme Lord Tianlan opened his eyes and looked at the young man's back. After a while, he said, "I believe you." Lu Chen nodded and then walked out of the courtyard without saying another word. When the sky darkened, Lu Chen returned to his residence on Kunlun Mountain. He walked all the way, expressionlessly pushing open the door and turning back to lock it. When the wall and the door finally completely separated him from the outside world, he stood there quietly. He stood there for a long time. The light and shadow were quietly changing. Darkness gradually filled this place and his figure also merged into the shadows. No one would see that in his sleeves, under his lapel, there was an extremely subtle and desperately suppressed slight trembling of his hands. It was very quiet in the darkness. There was no light, no wind, and no sound. The darkness was like a surging black tide, surging soundlessly and rolling in front of him like waves. He raised his head in a daze. In the depths of his dark eyes, a black flame suddenly burned. That flame seemed to instantly bring him back to 10 years ago. Boom! That earth-shattering boom, that majestic pillar of light that pierced through the darkness, and that crack that tore through the sky. An unimaginably vast power turned into a dazzling light that shone on the figures of the four people. They let out painful and excited roars of joy. The fire raged and the strange seed seemed to be reborn, growing, and blooming in the flames. Heaven and earth. God subduing incantation. The wild power tore apart the earth and sky. Only the dark shadow stood silently. Behind the light, a black dagger was pulled out. The black fire in the depths of the pupils suddenly flourished. It burned crazily, as though it wanted to burn through the traces of time and erase everything. It was a blade that had pierced through time, cutting through flesh and blood, stabbing into the heart. As a result, blood sprayed out like a torrent. The old and distorted, terrified and angry face turned around, staring straight into his eyes. The black fire burned. The soul roared. The dark blade stabbed into the light, and the surging power surged like a tide. It was as if it had finally found a gap in the dam, and with a loud bang, it broke through everything. Thus, the light and darkness merged into one. Thus, all cause and effect, turned into fragments, chaotically thrown away in that memory. Like a desolate night rain, it floated down and disappeared. Only that power, that incomparably powerful power, was still clearly engraved in his heart. He lay down on the cold ground in the darkness. Slowly, he opened his eyes again. It was as though he had woken up from the deepest and most difficult nightmare, painfully but firmly. He panted slightly. After a long time, when everything calmed down, he raised his right hand and quietly looked at the outline of the palm in the darkness. That hand had once held a sword. Had once killed people. And had once felt that power that fell from the sky, in the blood and fire, light and darkness. The people of the world respected the heavens, respected the earth, and respected the gods. That power was like the gods. The four figures in the intersecting light and shadow, at the last moment, seemed to be as powerful as the gods. The black fire burned in his eyes and slowly extinguished. Finally, everything returned to nothingness. Darkness filled the room. The surroundings were quiet. He lay there quietly. Suddenly, as though he had thought of something, he moved his head and slowly sat up. The surroundings were so quiet. It was as though he was the only person left in the world. At this time, Lu Chen suddenly realized that it had been a while since he had felt this lonely feeling. Every night that should have been a lonely night, every time he woke up in the darkness, he would hear a light and familiar breathing sound, and he would feel a warm and beating body. So it was because of it that he no longer felt lonely. In the darkness, Lu Chen sat for a moment. Then, he looked around. The quiet darkness was as still as water. He softly called out, "Atsu." Chapter 133. The darkness was as silent as the sea under the night sky. There was no sound, but it seemed like the undercurrent was surging. The silhouettes in the house were vague, but there was no warmth. Atsu was not in this house. Lu Chen sat silently for a while, then slowly stood up. Darkness surrounded him and rolled around him without a sound. Lu Chen looked around and saw everything that should have been in the house, except for the black dog with a lame hind leg. He was silent, his eyes shining faintly in the darkness. After a while, he walked to the back of the house, squatted down, and saw that the small dog hole that had appeared because of the earthquake was still there. Everything was the same as usual, but Atsu, who would come back to sleep every night, was gone. Lu Chen stared at the dog hole for a moment, then suddenly stood up and strode to the door. With a squeak, the door was pulled open by him. In an instant, the darkness of the night outside the house rushed in like a flood. It was a deep night outside, a night where no light could be seen. The silent, empty land was unusually desolate that night. The cold wind swept past, blowing across his face. There was a trace of coldness that seemed to seep into his flesh. The night was bleak. At dawn the next day, when the first ray of morning light shone into the house through the gap in the window, Lu Chen, who was sitting by the bed, raised his eyes and looked at the ray of dawn. There was a trace of coldness in the warmth of the morning light, as if the chill from last night had not completely dissipated. But after a while, when the sun rose, all the darkness and coldness would disappear. He sat in the house all night, but Atsu still did not come back. Lu Chen's face did not show much fatigue, but his eyes were a little cold. When the sun rose, the Kunlun party seemed to have just woken up from last night's sleep. Many people opened their doors and went out. Lu Chen was among them, beginning a new day. He walked with a calm expression, without anxiety or panic, without exhaustion or impatience. Just like in the past, he quietly walked toward the spiritual field that belonged to him in the flowing fragrance garden. At the entrance of the grass garden, he met many odd job disciples with the same status as him. Everyone was acquainted with each other and greeted him with smiles. Lu Chen did the same. As if nothing had happened, he smiled and nodded at the people around him. Just as he was about to enter the entrance of the grass garden, He Changxing walked past him and turned his head to look at him. Lu Chen also turned to look at him. Their gazes met, and He Changxing smiled. He said indifferently and with a hint of alienation, "Morning." Lu Chen nodded and said, "Morning." After exchanging greetings, the two of them parted ways and walked towards their respective spiritual fields. However, after walking a few feet, Lu Chen's footsteps paused. He turned around and looked at He Changxing's back as he walked away. He stared deeply at him. The day passed peacefully. When dusk came, the odd job disciples in the flowing fragrance garden began to pack their things and prepare to go back. Lu Chen left the spiritual field and walked outside. On the way home, intentionally or unintentionally, he took a longer detour and walked past the spiritual field that was newly assigned to He Changxing. The spiritual field was empty. He Changxing, who had always been diligent and willing to work, seemed to have left early on this day. Looking at the empty spiritual field, Lu Chen frowned and then left in silence. On the way back from the meadow garden, he fell behind everyone. The afterglow of the setting sun cast a slanted shadow on the ground. When he could already see his house in the distance, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. He stared at his shadow on the ground for a while, then turned around and walked in another direction. Unlike the living quarters of the odd job disciples on Rock Mountain, the treatment of the odd job disciples in the flowing fragrance garden was much better. It was probably because the odd job disciples who were able to come here were much more useful than ordinary people. Therefore, most of the odd job disciples had their own rooms, and they were not close to each other. Lu Chen did not spend much effort to find He Changxing's residence. When he walked around the house, he knew that there was no one in the house. He Changxing had not returned yet. He turned his head to look at the setting sun, then walked to the side and sat down under a big tree. Not long after, when the sky gradually darkened, the shadow of the big tree moved over and covered his figure, making it look a little blurry. He waited here for a long time. It was not until the sky turned completely dark and the moon began to rise into the night sky that a figure walked quickly in the distance. That person's pace was not fast, but it seemed very relaxed. He was even humming a little song that others could not understand from time to time, as if he was in a very good mood. When he came close, with the help of the light, he could see that this person was Enchanting. He obviously didn't notice Lu Chen sitting in the shadow of a tree by the side of the road. He just walked on smugly, and just like that, he walked past. And Lu Chen did not open his mouth to stop him. He just silently hid in the dark shadows, looking at Enchanting's back with a cold gaze. The night passed peacefully. Lu Chen lay on his bed, quietly watching the darkness in the house until the sky brightened again. That night, Atsu still did not return. Early in the morning, Lu Chen, like the other odd-job disciples, got up, washed up, and went out. His cold expression disappeared the moment he opened the door, and then he warmly greeted the people around him, joked, and walked together to the flowing fragrance garden. At the entrance of the garden, he saw a few people walking in front of him. One of them slowed down, turned around, and greeted Lu Chen and the others with a smile. That was Enchanting. When the sunlight shone on his face, he saw Lu Chen with a smile, and then a concerned smile appeared on his face. He said to Lu Chen with a smile, "Good morning." "Hey, why do you look a little haggard? Did you not sleep well last night?" Lu Chen was surprised, turned his head to look at the people around him, and said, "It can't be, do I not look awake?" The people around him laughed and shook their heads, and said, "Not at all, you look very energetic." Lu Chen breathed a sigh of relief, and said to Enchanting with a smile, "You scared me, actually I slept well last night." The smile on Enchanting's face seemed to freeze for a moment, then he nodded, and said, "That's a good thing." With that, he turned around and walked into the garden. Lu Chen joked with his friends next to him, but his gaze followed Enchanting's back, and in the depths of his eyes, there was a faint flash of a dark flame. It was another normal and peaceful day. At noon, Lu Chen left his own spirit field, and walked around the garden. When he passed by Enchanting's spirit field, he found that there was no one there. The spirit herbs in the spirit field looked a little listless, and the weeds at the side were growing a little too vigorously, as if they hadn't been taken care of for a long time. Lu Chen looked at this scene indifferently, and after standing beside the spirit field for a moment, he turned around and left. Everything seemed to be a repeat of yesterday. At dusk, Lu Chen once again came to Enchanting's room, and after confirming that there was no one in the room, he sat down in the same position as yesterday, and began to wait patiently. Night fell, and there were no stars and no moon. This night seemed to be darker than usual. A cold wind blew in the mountains, and it seemed to be a bit chilly. The branches and leaves on the large trees shook, and the dark shadows swayed continuously. He sat in the darkness, as if he had already become one with the shadows. This night, he waited a little longer than the night before, and even when it was almost the midnight of the curfew, he saw Enchanting's figure return from the road in the distance. But today, he seemed to be different from yesterday. He didn't have that kind of light footsteps and happy mood. As Enchanting walked over, he let out a few angry curses from time to time. It was unknown what he was cursing, but he even looked a little flustered and exasperated. When he walked closer, Lu Chen could even see that there were a few more tears on Enchanting's clothes, and there were also some vague dark marks, which looked like blood stains. Bastard, bastard, motherf asterisk cur, are all bastards. He kept on cursing, and the expression on his face was the same as he gnashed his teeth, as if he wanted to cut someone into 1,000 pieces with a deep hatred. Then, cursing and swearing, he walked back to his room. The night wind blew coldly. The leaves rustled. Lu Chen's gaze seemed to ignite a flame in the shadows, a dark, silent flame. He stared coldly at Enchanting's back, but until he walked back to his room, he still didn't move. After a while, he stood up, turned around, and walked into the deeper darkness, disappearing. This night, the wind was strong, and the night was cold. Lu Chen lay on his bed in his room, surrounded by darkness. Even though it was late at night, he did not feel sleepy at all. He opened his eyes and stared at the seemingly endless darkness around him. Beside his hand, the darkness seemed to be particularly thick, as though it were nurturing something strange. It twisted and turned silently, and occasionally, a flash of light would flash by, before disappearing in the blink of an eye. In the silence of the night, it was as though there was only loneliness left in the world. At this moment, Lucien felt as though he could hear his own heartbeat. It was eerily quiet. Until, a soft voice suddenly floated over from somewhere in the dark night. It came with the wind. It was soft and soft, almost like a gasp, almost like a soft hum. Little by little, it approached, and struggled. In the darkness, Lucien suddenly sat up. His eyes shone brightly, and he turned to look at the door. The night wind blew coldly. Somewhere in the darkness outside the door, there was suddenly a soft sound. It sounded like a sigh, and yet it also sounded like a call. It sounded like a strange spirit, emitting a hair-raising low cry in the middle of the night. Lucien got off the bed, strode to the door, and yanked it open. The darkness surged over like a tidal wave, and it completely swallowed his entire body with the force to topple mountains and overturn seas. Chapter 134. The night wind blew coldly, and the chill of the night seemed to penetrate deep into his bones. Outside the door, under the shadow, a small black shadow was curled up. When it heard the sound of the door opening, it seemed to tremble. Then, it slowly raised its head and looked at Lucien, who was standing at the door. The night was deep and boundless, making the whole world seem like it was shrouded in darkness. Except for a bit of green light in the shadow. That was Atsu's eye. Lucien stood quietly at the door. For a moment, when his eyes met that slightly green eye, he even subconsciously held his breath. He originally thought that he had long been used to the darkness, that he had blended into the shadows in countless dark nights. He originally thought that he had seen a lot of blood, hatred, betrayal, and cruelty. He originally thought that his heart was already as hard as stone. He originally thought that he would no longer feel fragile, touched, sad, and the pain brought by these things. He was wrong. He realized that he was wrong. He slowly squatted down, the muscles in his body tensed up bit by bit, as if this was the only way he could control his body. In front of him, there was a thick smell of blood. He glanced around from the corner of his eyes. On the dark road that he came from, there was a faintly discernible, long line of blood. It was the result of his painful body rubbing against the hard and rough gravel, leaving behind bloodstains. Atsu was lying in front of him. It was awake, but for some reason, it was unusually quiet. Lucien silently reached out and stroked its body. Where his hand touched, there was a slightly wet and sticky feeling. His hand froze for a moment, then he slowly retracted it and placed it in front of his eyes. In the dim light, blood slowly flowed between his fingers and palms, like the sinister smile of a demon in the darkness. Pa! With a soft sound, a spark lit up in Lucien's hand, illuminating the place in front of him and illuminating Atsu in the darkness. It was as if time had suddenly reversed on this night, returning to the day when he first met Atsu in the land of chaos. The miserable shadow of the black puppy overlapped with the scene in front of him. Atsu looked very miserable. There were at least dozens of cuts on its body. Blood and flesh covered its back and abdomen. There was almost no intact skin on its body. Only half of its tail was left, and the other half was missing. Its two hind legs were completely limp on the ground, and large patches of white bones were directly exposed. Only its two front legs looked intact, but they were also badly mutilated. It looked like it had climbed back by relying on these two front legs. A piece of its ear was missing, and there were several terrifying scars on its head, as if it had been directly chopped by a sharp blade. On its face, there was a deep scar that slashed diagonally across its left eye, leaving only an empty hole with a trace of blood flowing from it. The green eyes reflected the light of the fire. That was the last, eye. A low and soft sound slowly came out from between Lucien's teeth. After a moment, he threw away the torch in his hand. The flame was instantly extinguished, and darkness rushed in. He stretched out his hands and gently held Atsu in the darkness. Blood flowed down and dyed his clothes red. The blood, which was no longer very warm, slowly dripped on his skin. He hugged it tightly, bringing it close to his chest. As if it had heard the familiar sound of his heartbeat, Atsu raised its head, its green eyes flashing with a hint of relief, like a sparkling gemstone shining in the night, covering all its pain. It struggled to lift its body, stuck out its tongue, and gently licked Lu Chen's face. Then, its body tilted and sank into the darkness. The night was so long, and it seemed like a sad life would never end. The night wind whistled non-stop, sweeping past the towering mountains and lofty ridges, stirring up the dark clouds in the sky, but it still could not blow away the dense fog in the depths of Kunlun Mountain. A few bolts of lightning flashed through the depths of the clouds, twisting like wild silver snakes. After a moment, there was the rumbling of thunder in the sky. For strange peaks suspended between the clouds were incomparably tall. In the night, they were like four giants, standing in four directions, guarding the fog in the depths of Kunlun. On the winter peak, which was like a world of ice and snow, the highest peak was still surrounded by a violent snowstorm. On the cliff below, a skinny old man was standing with his hands behind his back, staring at the darkness below. His bright eyes, which were completely different from his withered aura, seemed to be able to penetrate the darkness and see the depths of the fog there. Not far behind him, White Lotus was standing quietly at the side. In this cold night, for some reason, the incomparably powerful True Lord did not have his two famous disciples by his side, but only this little girl who was just over 10 years old. But it seemed that White Lotus had a cold expression, standing expressionlessly. Other than the respect she had for Hakushin Jinkun in front of her, no other emotion seemed to exist on her face. For a young girl, this seemed to be an unusual thing. After an unknown period of time, Hakushin Jinkun turned around and looked at White Lotus. His gaze fell on the white ferret fur on her body, and he smiled and said, "Are you cold?" "Not cold," White Lotus said calmly. Hakushin Jinkun nodded, and his eyes revealed a trace of gratification. He even sighed slightly and said, "This child, your talent is too good after all. You have only cultivated the snow wind scripture for a short period of time. Although you can't say that you have reached a higher level, but you have already made some small achievements, and you have some resistance to the cold wind and snow." White Lotus shook her head and said, "I am still far from it. Not to mention other things, if I did not have this precious ferret fur coat on me, I am afraid that I would not be able to stand here for so long." Hakushin Jinkun smiled and said, "Even so, it is already very good. Ordinary people cannot even stay on this winter peak." White Lotus lowered her head and said, "It is all thanks to Master's training." Hakushin Jinkun turned around and looked at the deep night in the distance, and the tall mountain peaks in the depths of the night. His eyes fell on one of them, and he stared for a long time. Suddenly, he said, "Do you know what is on that mountain?" White Lotus followed his gaze and thought for a while. Then, she said, "That should be the summer peak. It is the place where Martial Uncle Tianlan, another perfected lord of Huashan realm in our sect, meditates." "Yes." Hakushin Jinkun looked at the shadow of that tall mountain, and his eyes flickered slightly. After a while, he suddenly smiled and said, "Lian, your talent is excellent. In the future, as long as you do not go astray, there is no need to say that your future is promising. I am old, and my chi and blood are declining. I don't know how long I can take care of you. If you meet your martial uncle Tianlan in the future, you must always maintain respect and must not be rude." White Lotus nodded and said, "I understand." She paused and could not help but look a little curious. Then, she said, "Master, I have not seen martial uncle Tianlan since I came up here. What kind of person is he?" "He." There was a flash of brilliance in the depths of Hakushin Jinkun's eyes. He slowly looked at the dark fog that was like an abyss under his feet. After a while, he suddenly said, "My junior brother is overflowing with talent and bold vision. He is a peerless figure that I have never seen in my life. White Lotus did not seem to expect that her master would have such a high evaluation of the youngest uncle. She was surprised for a moment, and then her eyes showed a yearning look. She thought to herself, to be able to get such an evaluation from a perfected lord of Huashan realm, he must be an unimaginable genius. However, Hakushin Jinkuan smiled and looked at White Lotus with a gentle look in his eyes. He said, "When you grow up, you should be able to understand a truth." "What truth, master?" "No one is perfect." White Lotus secretly glanced at Hakushin Jinkuan and said, "You mean?" Hakushin Jinkuan smiled and reached out to touch her head. He said, "When you grow up, I will tell you a secret, okay?" "Okay." Hakushin Jinkuan laughed and then walked away from the cliff with his hands clasped behind his back. White Lotus sneaked a peek at the darkness at the bottom of the cliff and followed. The soft light shone in the ancient tree hole. The misty green aura wrapped around the tree wall and quietly stared down. Lu Chen brought the dying Atsu here and carefully placed him on the open space beside the puddle. Atsu's injuries were extremely serious and his body was in a terrible state. He looked even more miserable than when he was in the Demon Flower Valley in the Land of Chaos. Lu Chen looked at its appearance and frowned deeply. His eyes flickered with uncertainty. He reached out and fiddled with the water, only to see that the water was clear and transparent, but it no longer had the magical green vitality from before. He had used up that magical aura. Now, there was only a cluster of strange black fire at the bottom of the puddle. Lu Chen stayed silent beside the puddle for a long time. It was as if he had thought of all the methods, but he still could not find any panacea that could save Atsu's life. It was too seriously injured. For a moment, he raised his head and looked around. This ancient tree hole was full of vitality. The tree walls were mottled and there were two strange doors hidden in the shadows. Other than that, it was like a strange place that was naturally isolated from the rest of the world. Lu Chen lowered his head and gritted his teeth. He looked at the fallen Atsu at his feet. After a while, he seemed to have made up his mind and let out a long sigh. He flipped his palm and the incomparably sharp black dagger appeared in his hand. From the side, his face was as cold as an ice-cold rock. Even his eyes had become emotionless. He no longer hesitated, and without any hesitation, he stabbed his wrist with his sword. Blood immediately gushed out and dripped down his wrist. He expressionlessly stretched out a finger and dipped it in the blood. He stared at it for a moment before pressing it forward. Chapter 135. When his finger pressed forward, drawing a bright red and dazzling blood mark in the air, deep in Lu Chen's eyes ignited a deep dark flame. In that instant, his entire aura, temperament and even breathing suddenly changed. An indescribable dark aura spread out from his body. At the same time, as if attracted by an incomparably strange power, the blood that flowed down from his wrist, the beads of blood and droplets of blood, suddenly drew out a thin line of blood that was as thin as a slippery thread. It gently floated up and silently swept past an inch or so from the ground, following Lu Chen's finger that seemed to be as heavy as 1,000 caddies as it floated forward. His finger paused, then suddenly pressed down. At the same time, the black flame in Lu Chen's eyes suddenly rose, like a sudden wild flame. A muffled sound came from the ground, like the morning bell and evening drum in an ancient mountain temple, faintly reverberating. A spot of blood appeared on the ground, then strands of blood, strangely twisting on the ground, began to spread out in many directions, forming one after another indescribable strange pattern. Lu Chen's hand slowly moved in the air, from the original one finger had become 5, the number of blood lines drawn from the blood increased, the strange pattern drawn on the ground also gradually began to take shape. It was a large triangular pattern, within it there were countless hard-to-grasp twisting patterns, but the pattern formed by the blood, with the puddle and the tree hole as the center, completely wrapped around it. After an unknown amount of time, Lu Chen's hand slowly stopped, his face looked very pale, as if he had used up most of his strength. In front of him, there was a strange blood pattern that was almost complete. It looked like a strange formation, but when one looked at it from a distance, they would suddenly discover that the strange triangular pattern vaguely resembled a tree. The water in the puddle was still calm without any ripples, as if it was not affected by the sudden appearance of the blood-colored pattern. However, for some reason, the cluster of strange black flames hidden in the depths of the water suddenly began to sway incessantly. A faintly discernible and hidden power seemed to be hidden in the still quiet blood pattern, like a person's heartbeat in the middle of the night, indistinctly, inexplicably throbbing. The entire tree hole was in silence, the green gas, the tree walls, the two mysterious and unopenable doors, all silently watched everything that happened here. Lu Chen looked at the pattern that appeared in front of him. His expression seemed somewhat tired, somewhat complicated, and a trace of inexplicable perplexity, but very quickly, his eyes lit up again. He bent over and picked up Atsu, slowly walked into the blood pattern, and knelt down beside the puddle. There were slight ripples on the water surface, reflecting his face. He silently looked at the figure in the water, and then gently put Atsu into the water. A few bubbles emerged from the water. The unconscious black dog swayed a few times in the water, and slowly sank down. Beside the water, Lu Chen took a deep breath, and suddenly slapped his palm backwards, not knowing which part of the strange blood pattern was hit, but there was a sudden sound, like thunder above the clouds, and in an instant, the ancient tree hole shone brightly. On the ground that was smeared with blood, a strange bloody light suddenly rose up and turned into a bloody and strange bloody pillar of light that was reflected in the air. The light's shadow twisted violently, accompanied by a howl, as if it came from the legendary yellow springs in the depths of hell. The blood shadow trembled and twisted, gradually turning into the shadow of a huge tree. It was a vague, faintly discernible tree, a towering tree, its head reaching the sky, its roots reaching the ground, a tree that existed everywhere across the three realms. Its whole body was blood red, as if every branch and every leaf was dripping with fresh blood. In that dreamy and terrifying illusion, countless drops of blood dripped from the terrible tree, as if hell was nothing more than this. Lu Chen took a deep look at the illusion. The corner of his eyes seemed to twitch slightly, but very quickly, he regained his senses. His arm drew a strange pattern in the void, and then slowly pressed down. Along with his action, a strange whistling sound rang out again. A strange light slowly flowed from the illusion, as if it had seeped into reality from the illusion. Bit by bit, it approached the puddle. The clear water suddenly jumped violently, as if it had felt an incomparably powerful force, and received an unimaginable stimulation. The water waves trembled wildly, breaking all the calm, and at the same time, there was a rumbling sound, coming from the depths of the puddle. The light in the blood shadow was still approaching, and it was about to touch the water. Lu Chen's face was as pale as paper at this time, but the black fire in his eyes burned more vigorously. The twisted flames even seemed to have a hint of wildness. Suddenly, the cluster of black fire in the depths of the water, as if it had been stimulated by something, suddenly flourished, and directly expanded dozens of times from the bottom of the water, like a demon directly opened its terrible mouth, and pounced upwards. Almost at the same time, the flowing light in the blood shadow touched the surface of the water. There was a sudden clap of thunder. Boom! All the water ripples suddenly shook violently, and in the midst of the rumbling sounds, they burst apart together, bringing along Atu, who was in the water, and directly rose up into the air. Under the back of that strange blood shadow, everything seemed to be stained with a smear of blood. The light shone into Atsu's body. The black fire caught up in the air, and the shadow instantly passed through Atsu's body, and then swayed in the shadow, as if it was crazily swaying towards the blood-red tree, trying to penetrate it. But the next moment, all the shadows disappeared together. Hua la 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 la, in the splashing water, Atsu fell down together with the clear water, and fell heavily back into the water. After a moment, an indescribable pain came from its mouth. It tossed and turned in the depths of the water, struggling to open its only eye slightly, and looked up. The water waves were still shaking violently, and in the chaotic light and shadow, there was a familiar face on the other side of the water waves, quietly looking at it. Although the face was pale, as if there was not a trace of blood. Atsu slowly closed its eyes again, like a child sleeping peacefully. In the quiet night, darkness seemed to be everywhere, and the vast Kunlun was immersed in the night. In the depths of the fog, behind the black board, there was a bottomless abyss of darkness that passed through the long crust of the earth, like a huge temple in ancient times. In the vast passage, there was also a sense of loneliness. No one knew where the faint light came from, and it sprinkled in this lonely temple. In the distance, the huge and ancient door was hidden in the depths of the darkness, like a lonely guard that had stood for countless years. Time seemed to have frozen here, as if there would not be the slightest change for thousands of years. But at a certain moment, in the mysterious and ancient tree hole, the blood-red rune suddenly lit up, summoning the incomparably strange blood-red tree that passed through the three realms. There was a sudden change here. The quiet darkness suddenly trembled slightly. The huge stone door stood majestically. There was no sound, no movement, and it seemed to be dead silent. There seemed to be hesitation. In the dead silence of the darkness, behind the seemingly endless and deep door, a voice suddenly came from the back. It was like the roar of a dragon and the roar of a tiger, as if the wind and clouds were changing, as if something was sighing deeply. The darkness suddenly expanded, expanding like a heartbeat. The entire stone door trembled, and a few tiny pebbles fell from the high, almost invisible ceiling. The buzzing sound was like thunder, and it caused the earth to tremble. But after a moment, it suddenly became quiet again, as if it was still sleeping, and as if it was sleeping peacefully, it was finally sleeping peacefully. The darkness quietly retreated, and returned to its original position. The stone door stood as straight as before, standing there silently. Time seemed to have frozen here once again, like a dream from which one would never wake up. Struggling and suffering, never waking up. This night would eventually pass, just like the countless nights in the past. The darkness would definitely pass, and the light would come. At dawn, when the morning light shone into the room through the window, a haggard Lu Chen sat on the ground. Atsu was wrapped in white cloth like a dumpling, with only one eye, mouth, and nose exposed. Atsu lay quietly in Lu Chen's arms, eyes closed, sleeping quietly. Its chest rose and fell slightly, and occasionally its face seemed to twitch, as if it was dreaming of some terrible scene. But in the end, this black dog finally calmed down, as if all the horror and fear had gone away from its warm chest. Lu Chen leaned against the wall and looked at the ray of dawn in silence. He didn't say a word. This day, he did not go out, nor did he go to the grass garden of Fragrance Garden. The Kunlun party was a place of rules, and of course, Bai Chao Tang was no exception. Fragrance Garden treated the handyman disciples better than Rockpan Mountain, but they would not indulge them at will. At least there was a daily roll call. Although sometimes after the roll call, some people would leave early after finishing their work, but the rules were rules. Unless they asked for leave in advance, there would be trouble. Lu Chen ran into trouble. Jean Dan Friar Lin Sheng, who was newly appointed to take charge of the grass garden after the earthquake, was a strict person. So when he found out that Lu Chen had skipped work for a day without reason, he called Lu Chen over the next day. What happened? Why didn't you come yesterday for no reason? Lin Sheng looked coldly at the young man in front of him, who did not seem to be in a good mood. There was an inadvertent but matter-of-fact contempt in the depth of his eyes. He said, letting you cultivate spirit herbs here is the sex trust and training in you. Don't you know that? Lu Chen lowered his head slightly. After a moment, he said, I was wrong. Do you have a reason? A moment of carelessness during cultivation. My breath became chaotic, and my meridians flowed in the opposite direction. I suffered internal injuries. Lin Sheng glanced at him, and his eyes swept across his face. After a moment, he nodded and said, Indeed, your internal breath is unstable, and there are signs of damage in your meridians. But you did not inform me in advance and did not come for no reason. That is wrong, and this reason cannot be defended. If your spirit herbs are damaged because of this, you will be expelled from Fragrance Garden immediately. Do you have any objections? Lu Chen lowered his head and was silent for a long time. Then he said, No, thank you for your magnanimity, uncle. Chapter 136. When he walked out of the house, Lu Chen's expression did not change. There was no anger, and no frustration. It was as if what Jean Dan Fryer had said to him did not affect him at all. He just looked up at the sky. The sun was high in the sky, and the sky was blue with white clouds. It was a sunny day. He looked at it for a while, and then walked towards the herb garden. Along the way, there were people coming and going, some of whom were acquaintances. Some greeted him, and some nodded at him. But Lu Chen seemed to have something on his mind. He was silent all the way, as if he did not see anything. He walked all the way to the entrance of the herb garden. The mountain breeze blew, and the unique herbal fragrance of the herb garden wafted over. Lu Chen looked at the neat spiritual fields in front of him. He looked at them expressionlessly, and then walked forward. But the direction he walked was not towards his spiritual field. Right at this moment, a pleasantly surprised voice suddenly sounded from behind him. "Big brother Lu, you. Why do you look so pale?" Lu Chen stopped and turned around. He saw Exian running over from behind. She looked at him worriedly and whispered, "Brother Lu, are you okay?" Lu Chen looked down. After a while, he shook his head and said, "I'm fine." Exian still looked worried. "Brother Lu, do you want to go back and rest? I can help you apply for leave." Lu Chen was silent, and then said, "You better not go to Uncle Lin Xing's place. He won't listen to you." Exian was a little surprised. "Forget it, I'll go with you first. It's not good to talk on the road." Lu Chen hesitated for a moment, and then looked at the people around him. Finally, he looked at a place in the distance, and then nodded. "Okay." "What?" Beside Lu Chen's spirit field, the two of them sat side by side on the ridge of the field. Exian looked a little annoyed and said indignantly, "How can Uncle Master Lin be like this? He clearly knows that something went wrong with your cultivation and hurt your body, but he still punishes you like this. Isn't this bullying?" Compared to when he first came to the herb garden, Lu Chen's expression seemed to be a lot better. When he saw Exian's annoyed look, he even smiled and comforted Exian. "Forget it, it was my fault." Exian bit her lip. "That won't do. Brother Lu, you are just a servant disciple. You don't have much income in Kunlun Mountain. Don't you count on the spirit herbs as rewards? Why did Marshal Uncle Lin just casually say it, and you?" "Because he is Jean Dan Fryer." Lu Chen smiled. Exian choked. For a moment, she was speechless. She didn't know what to say. After a while, she said gloomily, in any case, I just don't feel right." After a moment of silence, her eyes suddenly lit up and she said to Lu Chen, "Big brother Lu, why don't I secretly ask Marshal Aunt Yen and have her speak on your behalf? Uncle Yen is very good to me. If I ask her, she will definitely agree." Lu Chen stared at her, a glimmer of light flashing in his eyes. Then, he smiled and gently said, "No need. Your Marshal Uncle Yen is a well-known veteran Gold Core Realm cultivator. That favor isn't light, so why waste it on such a trivial matter? But you, didn't I say it's okay?" Lu Chen smiled and patted the girl's head. "Why can't you remember what I said?" I told you not to hit my head." Exian rubbed her forehead. However, after hearing Lu Chen's words, she relaxed a bit. She took out a small bag from her pocket and handed it to Lu Chen. "For you, brother Lu." Lu Chen took it and looked at it. "What is this?" "My family's tea." Exian smiled. "Didn't I mention it to you last time? Although this isn't our family's most famous tea, Little Crane, it's still a top-grade tea. It's not worse than most of the tea in Kunwa City's shops." Lu Chen nodded. The hand holding the bag of tea slightly tightened. When he looked up, he saw the sunlight shining down on them. The girl sitting on the ridge of the field was smiling sweetly. She was as beautiful as a flower and as warm as the sun. Even though there was a faint red scar on her beautiful face that couldn't be erased, all the darkness and sadness seemed to quietly dissipate at this moment in her warm smile. "Brother Lu, are you really okay? You look a bit absent-minded. Do you feel uncomfortable? Exan asked. Lu Chen smiled. I'm fine. Exan said, by the way, I haven't seen Atsu for a few days. How is it? Lu Chen looked at her and said, it's fine. It's the same as usual. I can't even see its shadow when it runs around all day. Exan pursed her lips and complained, that's right. I went to look for it several times during the day, but I didn't see it even once. Brother Lu, it keeps wandering around in the forest all day. I'm always worried that something might happen to it. Lu Chen was silent for a while and said, what you said makes sense. Exan suddenly became excited and said, yes. You didn't listen to me before. Today, you actually listened to me. Lu Chen smiled and said, don't worry. I've been quite busy recently. After this period, I'll keep it under control and won't let it run around. You can also come and see it often. Exan giggled and said, okay. Time was unknown in the mountains. Day and night could not be heard in the tree hole. In the ancient model tree hole, there seemed to be a kind of gentle light that always shone here. The water in the puddle on the ground seemed to be slightly murkier than before, but it was still clear enough to see the bottom of the water. On the ground around the puddle, the strange bloodlines had long disappeared. Now, there were only a few traces of blood left on the ground. There was no one in the tree hole, but there was a dog. Black Dog Atu's entire body was wrapped tightly in white cloth. It looked just like a white dog. It lay on the ground beside the puddle and slept for a long time. Then, it opened its eyes. The only eye it had left. The gentle light shone into Atsu's eyes. At first, it was a little surprised, but soon, it seemed to remember this familiar place and quickly calmed down. It turned its head and looked around. It found that Lu Chen was not here. This discovery made it a little worried, but soon, it realized that it was the only dog here, so it calmed down again. During this time, its eyes occasionally swept across the water, and it suddenly froze. There was a strange thing reflected in the water, a monster that was tightly wrapped in white cloth, and only its mouth, nose, and one eye were exposed. Atsu shrank back subconsciously. Then, as if it had noticed something, it shook its head at the monster in the water. The monster in the water also tilted its head. Atsu suddenly seemed to be a little happier, as if it had found something fun. It began to shake its head at the water, and after a while, it stopped. It felt a little thirsty. It moved its body, approached the puddle, and stretched its head to drink the water. The water rippled, and the sweet water slid down its throat. Atsu felt a lot better. But at this moment, it suddenly saw a shadow in the water. In its eyes, a black flame slowly lit up, burning quietly. Bang! A sound came, and Lu Chen appeared in this tree hole. He patted his clothes, stood up, and walked behind Atsu. He looked at it and said with a little surprise, "Hey, you're awake?" Atsu, who was lying by the water, slowly turned its head and looked at Lu Chen with its only eye. In the deepest part of its pupils, in an unknown place, a little black flame was burning faintly. That night, when it was dark in the mountains of Kunlun, the moon was dark, and the wind was strong. Soon, no one stayed outside. Lu Chen carried Atsu and walked quietly in the darkness of the night. It was as if he had merged with the surrounding shadows, and no one could detect him. After walking for a long time, Lu Chen stopped under a big tree. He first looked around, and then with one hand holding Atsu, who could not move, he easily climbed to the top of the tree trunk and hid in the dark. In his arms, Atsu looked around curiously, as if it didn't know why Lu Chen brought it here. Lu Chen didn't take any further action. He just sat on a branch with Atsu in his arms, and then whispered in its ear, "Don't bark. Wait here for a while." Atsu was a little confused. It looked at Lu Chen, but it still listened to Lu Chen's words and quietly nestled in his chest. On this chilly night, the man and the dog sat in the dense thicket and waited quietly. The night was getting darker, and the mountain wind was getting colder. The night in Kunlun seemed to be emotionless. It looked at the world coldly, and it looked at the vicissitudes of life. Lu Chen closed his eyes and waited in silence. From his angle, he could see the house in the distance through the gap between the branches and leaves. He didn't know when it was, but it was probably late at night. Finally, a figure came back from the distance. He walked quickly in the night and soon returned to the house. Halfway through, he suddenly stopped, as if he felt something. But when he turned his head and looked around, he didn't find anything. He frowned, and finally walked back to his house. In the deep shade of the trees, in the darkness, Lu Chen lowered his head and whispered in Atsu's ear, "Don't bark." Atsu looked at him and then nodded. Only then did Lu Chen slowly let go of his palm that was covering Atsu's ear. He stared at Atsu, and then he saw Atsu's throat emit a harsh and fierce growl. Under the creepy scar, it opened its mouth, revealing snow-white and sharp fangs. "I know," Lu Chen looked at it and said faintly, "You're tuning into the Romantic Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories."